My name is Tom Halsey. I'm 46 now. I was 43 then, which is an age where certain kinds of failure feel final in ways they maybe don't when you're younger. The divorce had been finalized the previous October. Carol got the house euro, which was fair. She'd made most of the payments when I was between projects, and I got a storage unit in Kennewick and a cardboard box of kitchen stuff I didn't have a kitchen for. My brother Danny let me crash in his second bedroom in Yakima from November through April, and I tried to be useful around the place and not mention how much the walls bothered me. The job loss had come first, actually, about 8 months before Carol told me she was done. I'd been a civil engineer with Benton County Public Works for 11 years. Road design, drainage, bridge load ratings, that kind of thing. Solid work, nothing glamorous. Then the county's road fund got decimated in a levee failure, and they cut half the department in one afternoon. I was project lead, so I thought I was safe. I was not. I drove home that Thursday in February, thinking about what I was going to tell Carol, and realized I didn't have a speech ready because until about 4 hours earlier, I genuinely had not thought this was coming. I tried consulting for a while. It's harder than it sounds when your entire professional network is people who just got the same pink slip you did. I picked up a few small jobs, a site assessment for a private gravel operation, some work reviewing drainage plans for a housing developer in Richland, but nothing that paid like steady employment. And the gaps between projects were long enough that I got good at mental math about how many weeks of savings I had left. I don't want to make this sound worse than it felt day to day. I had a place to sleep. I had Danny, who never once made me feel like a burden even when I probably was. I ate fine. But there was a particular kind of shame in being 43 and professionally adrift, and it followed me into every room. I'd apply for county positions in Yakima, in Kittitas County, even down in Walla Walla, and either get no response or get to the second interview and then nothing. I applied for a state DOT position and was told, very politely, that I was overqualified, which is a thing people say when they mean something else. The lookout job I found through the USA Jobs website, which I was checking every morning like some kind of ritual. The listing was posted by the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest, Methow Valley Ranger District, and it described a GS4 seasonal position as a fire lookout. The duties included fire detection and reporting, weather observations, maintenance of the lookout facility, and general monitoring responsibilities. It paid around $15 an hour, which wasn't much, but it came with housing euros, the lookout cab itself, and the season ran from mid-June through mid-September, which meant roughly 90 days of not paying rent. I almost didn't apply. Fire lookout felt like a young person's job, something a 22-year-old does between semesters, but I clicked through the requirements and there was nothing I couldn't meet. I had a valid driver's license, no felonies, and the physical fitness standard was basically that you could walk 2 miles with a loaded pack, which I could. I had experience with technical equipment from my engineering work, which I figured translated. I could read topographic maps in my sleep. So I applied. I wrote the federal RASUMA, which is its own strange exercise. You have to list every job in exhaustive detail and include the number of hours per week worked and the name and phone number of every supervisor you've ever had. I included my 11 years at the county. I listed Danny's address as my current residence and moved on. The hiring process took 6 weeks, which is fast for federal work. I got a conditional offer in mid-April, contingent on a background check and a physical. Both came back fine. The offer letter said I'd report to the Methow Valley Ranger Station in Twisp on June 12th for 3 days of orientation and training before being transported to my duty station at Kettle Peak Lookout. I'd never heard of Kettle Peak. I looked it up on a topo map and found it in the northeastern Cascades, in a section of forest that runs up toward the Canadian border and is mostly designated wilderness. The peak itself sits at 6,847 feet, and the lookout had been there since 1933, rebuilt in 1959, and refurbished in 1998. The Forest Service website had 2 photographs, one of the tower from below, all galvanized steel legs and diagonal bracing, and one looking out from the cab window toward a ridge line with snow still on it. The country looked big, empty. I thought, yes, this is exactly what I need right now. Danny drove me to Twisp, because my truck had developed an oil leak I didn't have money to fix yet. He didn't say much on the drive over Highway 20, just played the radio low and handed me a road atlas at the beginning like I might need to navigate, which I didn't. When he dropped me at the ranger station, he shook my hand instead of hugging me, which was its own kind of acknowledgement that something had shifted. The ranger station in Twisp is a brown Forest Service building set back from the highway at the edge of town. There were 3 other people in the orientation group, all younger than me. A woman named Becca who was getting a forestry degree at UW, a man named Kyle who'd been a lookout the previous season and was returning, and a quiet man named Paul who barely spoke during the 3 days and turned out to be an excellent question asker when he did. The orientation was run by a ranger named Glenn Yarber, who had the kind of patient, methodical manner that said he had given this same presentation many times and had stopped expecting enthusiasm from his audience. Glenn walked us through the incident command system structure for the district, the chain of communication, and what our actual job was going to be. The short version: you watch for smoke. When you see smoke, you take an azimuth reading with the Osborne Firefinder. You estimate the location as best you can using landmark references, and your topo map, you call it in on your radio to the duty officer at the ranger station. You file a written spot report in your logbook. You keep watching. That's most of it. We also covered weather observations, which are conducted twice daily in normal fire weather conditions and more frequently during red flag warnings. Dry bulb and wet bulb temperature readings, relative humidity calculated from a chart, wind speed and direction recorded from a handheld anemometer, and a general sky condition code. These get called in at 1,000 and 1,600 hours, and the information feeds into the fire weather forecasting system for the region. The Osborne Firefinder is a piece of equipment I want to describe carefully because it matters to this story. It's a circular metal base, about 30 inches in diameter, mounted on a pedestal table in the center of the lookout cab. On the base is a detailed topographic map of the area around your specific tower, printed and laminated under a clear circular plate. There's a rotating ring around the edge of the map, graduated in degrees, and on that ring sits a metal Aladad Acuro, essentially a long sighting device, like a very basic gun sight, mounted so it can be swung around in a full circle. You look through the peephole of the Aladad, aim at the column of smoke, and read the azimuth off the degree ring. Another lookout at a different station does the same thing, and the 2 azimuths, plotted on a map, cross at the location of the fire. This is called triangulation, and it's been working since the 1930s. The map on my Firefinder was current as of 2019. Glenn showed me how to read it, how to identify the named peaks and prominent features, how to note the difference between a confirmed smoke and what he called a suspicious haze, which might be smoke, or might be dust from a gravel road, or might be the morning heat rising off a south-facing rock slope. He was serious about this. False alarms cost resources. On the second day, we went over radio protocols. Each lookout has a call sign. Mine was Kettle Peak Lookout. The district dispatch station was called Methau Dispatch, and the duty officer, the person I'd be talking to on the radio, was a woman named Patty Olson, who'd been in that role for 9 years. Glenn brought her in to meet us in person, which I gathered was not always done. She was a solid woman in her late 50s, graying hair in a braid, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She shook all our hands and said, in a voice that was both friendly and extremely businesslike, that she was available on the radio from 0700 to 1800, 7 days a week, and that the emergency frequency was monitored 24 hours. She said if we ever had any concerns about our safety, to call immediately and not worry about the hour. She said it the way people say things they don't expect to matter, but she made eye contact when she said it. I noticed that. The third day was practical equipment. We went to a storage area behind the main building where they had a mock-up Osborne Firefinder set up, and we each practiced taking azimuths on photographs of smoke columns taped to the wall at various angles. Kyle already knew how to do it and finished quickly. I took longer, not because I couldn't do it, but because I wanted to understand the tolerances. How many degrees of error could you introduce and still get a useful triangulation? Glenn said plus or minus 2 degrees was acceptable. He was pleased I asked, I think. We also practiced with the radios, using Forest Service VHF radios, the motorized Sabre model with the external antenna. The units we'd take to the towers were battery-powered, charged from a solar panel, with a small backup propane generator for cloudy days. Glenn walked us through the charging system, the battery maintenance, and what to do if the radio failed. The answer was essentially, don't let the radio fail. When the orientation was over, Glenn told each of us our transport arrangements. Kyle and Becca were going to towers that could be reached by Forest Service Road. A truck would take them up on June 15th. Paul was going somewhere in the Chelan district, and wasn't my concern after that. My situation was different. Kettle Peak sits at the end of a forest road that becomes impassable about 2 miles before the tower, so the supply arrangement was a combination of road and trail. The truck, driven by a man named Frank Dahl, would take me and my gear up to the trailhead on June 15th and help me pack in from there. After that, Frank would bring supplies every 2 weeks, always on a Thursday, carrying up whatever I'd called in to Patty the week before. The list: propane canisters, food, water if the cistern was running low, batteries, any personal items I'd requested. Glenn gave me a packing list for my personal gear and said to keep it under 70 pounds total. I'd been preparing for this. I'd bought a used internal frame pack at a thrift store in Yakima and had been adjusting the fit for a week. I spent June 13th and 14th in Twisp at a motel, reading the Forest Service lookout manual and trying to sleep. The manual is thorough. There are sections on fire behavior, sections on radio communication procedures, sections on first aid, sections on what to do during a lightning storm, which apparently happens at those elevations with some regularity. One section is titled Psychological Aspects of Extended Isolation, and it's 3 paragraphs that mostly amount to: boredom is normal, use your scheduled radio contacts to stay connected, report to your supervisor if you feel your functioning is being affected. It's written in the particular voice of federal guidance documents, which manages to take genuinely important topics and make them feel like bullet points in a compliance training. I noted that the section didn't actually say what to do if your functioning was being affected. Just report it. June 15th was clear and warm in the valley. Frank Dahl picked me up at 0600 in a gray Forest Service F-350 with a crew cab and a bed rack, with some equipment strapped down under a tarp. Frank was 60-something, built like a man who had spent decades moving heavy things at altitude, with a gray mustache and ears that stuck out slightly from under a ball cap with the Forest Service shield on it. He had the radio on when I got in, a classic country station out of Spokane, and he turned it down but not off, and we drove north out of Twisp on Highway 20 for about 20 minutes before turning east on a road that quickly turned to gravel. He wasn't unfriendly. He asked where I was from, and when I said Kennewick, he said he had a brother-in-law down in the Tri-Cities who worked for one of the contractors at Hanford. He asked if I'd done lookout work before, and when I said no, he said it was a good job for the right kind of person. He said it mattered whether you were comfortable in your own head. I said I thought I was. He didn't respond to that, just nodded once. The forest road climbed steadily through ponderosa pine at first, then into mixed fir and spruce as we gained elevation. The road got rougher after the first 5 or 6 miles, and Frank dropped into 4 low without commenting. By the time we reached a small gravel pullout where the road ended at a gate, we were at around 4,000 feet, and the trees were smaller and farther apart. There was a wooden sign nailed to the gate post that said Kettle Peak Lookout 2.1 MI, and had an elevation number I couldn't read from inside the truck. We spent about 40 minutes packing things out of the truck bed and into the packs. Frank had a frame pack of his own that he loaded with propane canisters and water jugs. He'd told me the cistern at the tower had been cleaned and refilled in early June, but might need topping off. I had my personal pack. Together we were carrying probably 140 pounds of gear up a 2-mile trail with about 1,500 feet of elevation gain. The trail was mostly good. There were a few sections of loose rock and one steep switchback series near the top where you had to watch your footing, but it was well maintained and the distance wasn't extreme. We didn't talk much on the way up. Frank set a pace that was slower than I'd have walked on my own, but sustainable, and I realized he'd done this walk maybe 100 times and knew exactly how fast to go. I was breathing harder than I wanted to be. We came out above tree line about a half-mile from the top, and the view opened up all at once, the way it does in mountains. East was rolling high country going toward the Kettle Range. South was the valley we'd come from, hazy with distance. North was a ridgeline with some snow still in the northeast-facing draws. West was more forest climbing toward the main Cascades crest. The tower itself came into view from about a quarter-mile away. It's a standard L4 cab on a 65-foot steel tower, with an external staircase that zigzags up in switchbacks between the tower legs. The cab is 14 feet by 14 feet, painted gray-white with green trim, and it has windows on all four sides and a catwalk that goes around the outside. Standing on the summit in June with the light coming in from the east, it looked like something assembled from a kit, which I suppose it more or less was. Frank showed me the utility setup first before we went inside. The solar panels were mounted on the south side of the tower legs. There was a small battery bank in a weatherproof box at the base of the tower, connected to the panel and to a conduit that ran up the leg to the cab. There was a propane line from a locked cabinet that held 2 large cylinders, connected to a second line running up and into the cab, where it fed the cooktop and the small wall heater. There was also a separate box for the radio charger, which had its own panel connection. Frank showed me the water cistern Euro, a 500-gallon plastic tank, inside a small insulated shed adjacent to the tower base, and demonstrated the hand pump that brought water up to the cab through a hose. Then we went up. The staircase has a railing, but it's not anything you'd feel comfortable on in high wind. I counted 73 steps. At the top is a trap door in the catwalk floor, spring-loaded, and you push it up with your head and shoulders as you come through. The first time you do this, your brain spends a second figuring out that yes, you did just come up through a hole in the floor of a structure 60 feet off the ground, and the view in every direction does not help this calculation. The interior of the cab was clean. Frank had clearly been up here before the season started to do some basic prep. There was no dust on the Osborne Firefinder's Aladad. The windows were clean, and there was a folded blanket on the narrow cot against the east wall. The cab smelled of old wood and something slightly metallic, which I eventually figured out was the galvanized steel from the tower structure working through the floor. There was a small propane cooktop, a short counter with a metal sink that drained via a hose to the outside, a single wooden chair, and the map pedestal in the center of the room. Under the cot was a low cabinet built into the wall, maybe 8 inches tall, with a simple latch. The radio and charger were on a shelf beside the north window. Everything had the quality of objects that had been touched by many different people over many years, worn in specific places, repaired with functional rather than matching materials, endlessly maintained without being replaced. Frank went through the radio with me, running a check with Patty at the station. She came on clear and welcomed me in a brisk, professional way, confirmed the frequency, and signed off. Frank showed me the logbook, which was a green Forest Service form binder that held pre-printed observation sheets. There were sheets for daily weather observations and sheets for smoke reports. He showed me the small bookshelf above the sink where the reference materials were kept, a fire behavior pocket guide, the Okanogan Wenatchee Fire Weather Manual, a laminated card with the radio protocols, a spiral-bound procedure reference from the district, and 3 old logbooks in worn green covers. He pointed at the old logbooks briefly. "Previous seasons," he said. "You don't need to read them. They're just archived there." He said it in a way that wasn't quite casual enough, but at the time, I filed it somewhere in my mind and moved on. Frank stayed about an hour, walking me through the equipment one more time, checking the propane connections and the water pump. When he was ready to leave, he picked up his pack, pulled the trap door back, and then stopped with one boot on the top stair and looked at me. He said, "Radio check at 0800 tomorrow morning. Don't miss it." I said I wouldn't. He went down the stairs and I watched through the south window as he walked back down the trail and disappeared into the tree line below. I stood in the center of the cab for a minute after he was gone. The silence was immediate. Not library silent. The wind moved around the tower and made a low sound at the windows, and there was a raven somewhere down on the ridge calling in a way that bounced off the rock faces. But compared to Danny's house, compared to a motel in Twisp, compared to any human space I'd occupied in the past 6 months, it was close enough to silent to feel like a physical thing. I unpacked my personal gear into the storage space under the cot and on the small shelves above the sink. I made a meal on the propane cooktop, canned soup, crackers, instant coffee, and ate it looking out the east window at the Kettle Range going blue-gray in the late afternoon light. I wrote some notes in a personal journal I'd brought, not the official logbook. I noted the compass bearings of the major landmarks I could see, matching them to the Firefinder map. I noted the weather, clear, wind from the northwest at around 8 miles per hour, temperature maybe 62 degrees. I noted that the cot was narrower than it looked in the photographs. I tried to read. I'd brought 3 paperback novels and a history of the Columbia River I'd been halfway through since January. I couldn't make myself care about any of them. Instead, I sat in the wooden chair and watched the light change on the hills until it was dark enough that I couldn't see much. Then I turned on the small LED lantern I'd brought and lay down on the cot. The first night at elevation, after you've been at lower altitude for a while, is strange. Your breathing feels slightly wrong. Your body is warmer than you expect in a space that's been cold all day, and then the temperature drops fast around midnight, and you're too cold. I woke up twice and lay there listening to the wind and the faint sounds the tower made, a structural creak when a gust hit it, a tick from the cooling metal of the propane line, the tap-tap of what might have been a small moth at one of the windows. I thought about Carol. I thought about the storage unit in Kennewick, where the rest of my life was sitting in banker's boxes and furniture pads. I thought about the county engineering job, and whether there was anything I could have done differently in those last 6 months that would have changed the outcome. I decided there wasn't, and I'm not sure whether that was a comforting thought or a terrible one. I fell asleep around 2 in the morning and woke to thin gray light coming through the east window and a raven on the catwalk railing not 18 inches from my face, which startled me badly enough that I made a noise that probably startled the raven more. I lay there a minute while my heart settled, then got up and made coffee, and stood at the Osborne Firefinder table with the coffee in one hand and looked at the map. The map showed a circle of country about 50 miles across, centered on the Kettle Peak summit. Every named peak within that circle was marked. Every named ridge, every drainage. Forest Service roads were shown in dashed lines. Wilderness boundary was a heavy dashed line. There were a few small lakes and the upper reaches of 2 river systems. There were no towns within the circle. The nearest community of any size was about 30 miles south by road, maybe 20 in a straight line. Looking at that map was the first moment I thought, okay, I can do this. I called in the 0800 radio check on time. Patty's voice came through with the slight compression of the radio signal. She asked for call sign. I gave it. She acknowledged and said weatherabobs were due at 1000. I said yes, ma'am. She said she wasn't a ma'am, just Patty. I said understood. The first 2 weeks were mostly about learning to pay attention in a different way than I'd paid attention at any previous job. Engineering requires a specific kind of sustained focus. You're looking for errors, for tolerance violations, for things that don't conform to spec. Fire lookout attention is broader and more passive. You're not looking for a specific thing so much as you're watching a large area and waiting for anything that doesn't belong there. I learned to scan systematically, working in quadrants and moving back and forth through each quadrant, binoculars down at first to get the overall picture, then up in sections to check specific ridges and drainages where smoke would be visible if it was there. Morning scan, midday scan, afternoon scan. During red flag conditions, high temperature, low humidity, high wind, critical fire weather, you scan continuously. In the early part of my season, the weather was stable enough that I had long hours in the middle of the day with no smoke and good visibility, and I spent them learning the country. I got to know the visible terrain the way you get to know a map you're responsible for. I could tell you where the sun hit first on which ridge. I could tell you where the afternoon thermals developed in the canyon to the east. I knew which rock faces held morning shadow. I knew the color of the timber in different conditions, how the Douglas fir went blue-green in certain lights, how the larch stands were distinguishable from ponderosa even at 10 miles because of the slightly different green, how recent burns showed as gray-brown patches that never quite matched the surrounding timber in any season. I could read the smoke from burning by the color and character, could tell it from vehicle dust or mill smoke by the way it moved. This sounds like I'm claiming expertise I don't have. I want to be precise about it. I was a competent learner who paid attention. I wasn't a 30-year veteran. I got better at the job as the weeks went on, but I made errors early and probably would have made more if the fire weather had been more active. The routine settled into something I could live inside. Up at 6, make coffee and water for oatmeal, check weather, and make notes. 0800 radio check with Patty. 1,000 weather obs readings from the thermometers in the Stevenson screen, mounted on the platform outside the south window. Wind speed and direction from the handheld anemometer held out the north window. Sky condition. Call in the obs. Scan. Eat something at noon. Scan. 1600 weather obs end. Call in. Scan until the light was too low. Make dinner. Read or write in my journal. Sleep. Twice in the first 2 weeks I called in what I thought were smokes, and both times Patty asked me follow-up questions that helped me realize what I was looking at was something else. The first time it was road dust from a FS road on the south side of a ridge. You could see it by the character of the plume, which rose and then immediately dispersed laterally rather than continuing to build vertically. The second time was more embarrassing. What I thought was a small smoke in a canyon to the northeast turned out to be morning steam rising off a small pond as the sun hit it, visible only for about 20 minutes before the temperature equalized and the vapor stopped. Patty told me, patiently, that this happened all the time and that if I was uncertain, it was always better to call in than not. I was grateful for her manner on the radio. She was practical, and she never made me feel stupid. She had a way of giving information that didn't read as correction, just as additional data. "What's the wind doing down in the canyon?" she'd ask, and the question itself would tell me that if the wind was coming from the east, road dust from the eastern road was my most likely explanation. She'd been doing this long enough that she carried a mental model of the whole district's geography and fire weather patterns, and she deployed that knowledge efficiently. The loneliness was less bad than I'd expected. Not absent there were evenings that felt very long, and there were nights when the silence felt like a weight, but it wasn't unbearable. I'd been lonely in Danny's house in a different way, the kind of loneliness that's worse for being surrounded by someone else's normal life. Up here, the solitude felt at least honest. I called Danny once a week on a Saturday, using the cell phone I'd discovered had a weak but usable signal if I stood on the northwest corner of the catwalk. Those conversations were short and good. He'd tell me what was happening in Yakima, which was mostly about his job at the irrigation supply company and his girlfriend Rachel, and a problem his neighbor was having with a fence. I'd tell him about the weather and whatever small events had broken the routine. He always asked if I was eating. I always said yes. I did not call Carol. We'd agreed, through our lawyers, to a period of no direct contact while the property division was still pending, and I respected that, though I thought about breaking it probably every third day or so. Not because I thought the marriage was going to reassemble itself, more because she was the person I'd talked to every day for 9 years, and that habit doesn't end cleanly. There was a lot of time. That's not a complaint, but it's worth being precise about. A fire lookout on a low-activity week has more unscheduled hours than almost any job I can think of, and the question of how to use them is one that each person who takes the job has to answer for themselves. I'd brought books and didn't read most of them. I'd brought a small watercolor set, something I'd bought at a drugstore on an impulse in Twisp and hadn't used since high school, and I used it more than I expected, mostly making rough sketches of the ridgelines from different corners of the catwalk, trying to capture the way the light changed on specific peaks at different hours. I wasn't good at it, but I wasn't trying to be. It was something to do with my hands during the scanning blocks that let me keep my eyes on the country. I also spent time with the equipment in a way that went beyond what the training required. I took apart the radio's external charging connections and cleaned the contact points because one of them had shown a faint green oxidation. I lubricated the Alidad pivot on the Osborne Firefinder. It turned smoothly to begin with, but I had a feeling it would stiffen in the cold of late August, and it did, and because I'd already lubricated it, it didn't become a problem. I checked the propane fittings weekly and tightened a connection at the regulator that had developed the faintest hiss. Small things, engineering habits. The lookout was my responsibility for 96 days, and I was going to leave it the way I'd found it, which at the county had always been the professional standard I actually respected. The weather was what I thought about most, not as a subject of interest, exactly, more as a thing that structured my entire sensory life in a way that no desk job had ever managed. At the county, weather was something you checked on your phone to decide whether to bring a jacket. Up here, it was primary information, always. The marine layer that crept in from the west on certain mornings and sat in the valleys below while the peaks were clear, the way a lenticular cloud forming over the Cascades crest meant a wind change in 6 to 12 hours, reliable as a gauge reading, the color of the sky at sunset that told you whether tomorrow's RH would be favorable or critical, the high, thin cirrus that in summer meant a trough approaching, pressure dropping, lightning possible within 48 hours. I started a separate weather log in my personal journal, not because the official OBS required it, but because I wanted a record fine enough to see patterns. Not just the twice-daily readings, but everything I noticed. When the morning thermals developed over which drainages, how the cloud shadows moved across the ridges in afternoon, the exact quality of the light before a wind shift versus the light during stable high pressure. I'd been an engineer for 15 years and thought I understood data, but this was a different kind of data, embodied, continuous, something you had to be present for in a physical way that a column of numbers couldn't replace. I slept better as the weeks went on. The first 2 weeks, sleep had been difficult. The altitude adjustment, the unfamiliar sounds. But by early July, I was falling asleep before 10 and waking with the light, and there were nights so profoundly quiet that when I woke briefly at 2 or 3 to check the sky for lightning, the silence felt like a weight in the room, something with a texture, something that took up space. The wildlife was part of the daily texture too. The raven that had startled me on the first morning became a regular presence. I wasn't sure if it was the same individual every day, but it behaved consistently, claiming the northeast corner of the catwalk railing most mornings, and sitting there with the particular composed attention of a bird that knows it's being observed. I started leaving crumbs of crackers on that corner railing, which I knew I wasn't supposed to do, and which I did anyway. A family of pikas lived in the talus on the east face of the summit, and I could hear them through the east window in early morning, their high alarm calls carrying in a way that seemed too loud for such small animals. Twice I watched a black bear work through the lower end of the subalpine meadow below the tower, moving with a thoroughness that reminded me of a surveyor checking everything, covering the ground methodically, showing no interest in me or the tower. I thought about the divorce less than I'd expected to. It wasn't that I'd resolved anything or stopped caring about it. It was more that up here the personal story had been shrunk by the geography. The things that had seemed enormous in Danny's spare bedroom, the failure of the career, the failure of the marriage, the whole uncomfortable question of what a 43-year-old man does with the second half of his life when the first half has come apart, were still present, but had been somehow put in proportion. The mountains were older than any of it. The raven didn't know or care. The fire that would start on that south-facing slope in August would start whether I was functional or not, and my job was to be functional enough to see it when it happened. That realization, which sounds simple but took about 3 weeks to actually settle into, was probably the most useful thing the job gave me. The first genuinely strange thing happened on the night of July 7th. I'm certain of the date because I checked the journal entry afterward, and because July 7th was a day I remember clearly on its own terms. It had been a red flag day, the first significant one of my season, and I'd been scanning almost continuously from 1000 through sunset, exhausted, and I'd seen and reported an actual smoke in the early afternoon. The smoke was small, about 1/10 of an acre by the time I spotted it, coming from a lightning-struck ponderosa on a ridge about 12 miles to the southeast. I remember the moment I picked it up clearly. I was on the southeast quadrant of my afternoon scan, maybe an hour past the 1600 OBS, and I saw what I first thought was a dust plume from an invisible road. Then I watched it for 30 seconds, and it didn't dissipate laterally, it built, and I knew. I swung the Alidad Euro. My heart was going faster than it should have been, which I put down to the fact that this was my first real smoke, and took the reading, checked it, took it again. The two readings were within half a degree of each other. I noted the landmark reference, south face of a ridge, below the summit I'd been calling Jackknife in my journal, which had a distinctive double notch at the ridgeline that I could find easily on the Firefinder map. I put the binoculars on it and watched it for another minute, watching the character of the smoke, white-gray, building vertically, no lateral spread yet, consistent with a fresh start in timber, with live fuel moisture still relatively high from the last rain system a week before. I keyed the radio. My voice was steady, which I was proud of, and the report came out clean. Call sign, location description, azimuth, estimated size, fuel type, aspect, behavior, spotting potential. Patty acknowledged and asked for the smoke character. I described it. She said she'd check the lightning detection for the previous night and get back to me. She came back in about 8 minutes. There had been a lightning cell through that area the previous night around 0300, single strike cell, and this was consistent with a delayed ignition. A delayed ignition is when a lightning strike hits a tree but the fire doesn't actually establish itself visibly for 6 to 12 hours or more, smoldering in the duff or in punky wood at the base until the afternoon heating cycle draws it out. This is one of the more dangerous ignition types because by the time you see it, the fire has often been building for a long time in materials where it's had a chance to establish a solid heat base. I kept the binoculars on the smoke. It grew slowly over the first hour from 1/10 of an acre to maybe 2/10 euro, and then the afternoon wind picked up from the northwest and the growth rate increased. By 1800, it was approaching an acre. The smoke column had started to lean downwind, and I could see small spot fires ahead of the main fire in the grass on the open slope below the tree line. I reported the spotting to Patty, who updated the resource order. A crew reached it by trail at dusk. I could see their headlamps on the ridge as the light dropped, a line of small orange-white points moving laterally along the fire edge. By 2030, Patty told me they had a line around the head and were mopping up the flanks. Contained at 1.2 acres, declared at 2200 hours. The whole thing was exactly the procedure I'd been trained on, and it worked exactly as described, and I felt a competence I hadn't felt in a long time. Not exhilaration, not excitement, more like the satisfaction you get when something you built does what it's supposed to do. The system worked. I'd done my part of it correctly. The fire was out. I ate dinner late, around 8:30, and was in the cot by 9:30, which was early for me, but not unusual after a red flag day. The cab had cooled quickly after sunset, and I was warm in the sleeping bag, and I was genuinely tired. I don't know what woke me. I came up out of sleep quickly and completely, the way you do when something specific has disrupted you, rather than just a natural waking. The LED lantern was off. The cab was dark. I lay still and listened. The wind had dropped. It was very quiet. The structural sounds the tower made in wind were absent, and without them the cab felt different, oddly enclosed. Then the radio spoke. It was a male voice. Clear, even, slightly compressed by the radio transmission. The cadence was familiar. It was the cadence of a Forest Service spot report, the same rhythm I'd been practicing since Glenn's orientation, the same structure Patty used when she repeated information back to confirm it. It sounded like someone reading from a form. I lay in the dark and the voice said, reading carefully, Smoke report, Kettle Peak Lookout, 1-2 July, 0940 hours. Azimuth, 268 degrees from Kettle Peak. Estimated location, unnamed ridge approximately 9 miles west-southwest of Kettle Peak, grid reference. And here, it gave a Forest Service grid reference I didn't write down fast enough. Estimated size at initial report, 0.2 acres. Timber type, subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. Aspect, south-facing. Wind-driven, upslope. No structures or values at risk within 1 mile. Spotting potential, moderate to high. Request initial attack resources. Then silence. I sat up on the cot. I reached for the radio on its shelf and clicked on the reading light. The radio display showed the channel indicator blinking green, signal received. But there was nothing further. I checked the time, 1:17 a.m. I sat with the radio in my hands for a while. My first thought was testing that Patty, or someone at the station, was running a drill transmission, maybe testing the equipment at off hours. This seemed unlikely, given the hour, but not impossible. My second thought was crosstalk from another district of that I'd picked up a transmission from another tower in a neighboring district that happened to be on a frequency close enough to bleed through. This happens with VHF radio in mountain terrain. The signal bounces in ways that aren't always predictable. The third thought, which I didn't let myself think all the way through, was that the date in the transmission was July 12th. It was July 7th. I set the radio back on its shelf. I lay back down. I listened for another transmission and didn't hear one. After maybe 40 minutes, I fell asleep again, and when I woke at 6, the world looked ordinary, and I had already constructed a reasonable explanation. Crosstalk. Testing. Maybe I'd half-dreamed it and inserted familiar professional language into a noise that wasn't actually a coherent transmission at all. The brain does that with radio. It has a tendency to find speech patterns in compressed audio the way it finds faces in clouds. I ate breakfast, did my scans, called in the 0800 check. I mentioned to Patty that I'd picked up a transmission on the radio overnight, around 010'ed, and asked if there had been any system tests run. She said no, and asked what I'd heard. I said it sounded like a spot report, male voice, but the time was wrong, and I thought it was probably crosstalk. She said she'd note it and check with the radio technician about possible frequency bleed from the Chelan district. She didn't seem concerned. She moved on to the weather abab's schedule. I let her move on. I told myself I'd let it go, and mostly I did, for 5 days. July 12th came on a Wednesday. The weather had cooled since the red flag day, and visibility was good, a clean northwest airflow that made the far ridges sharp. I was on my morning scan when I picked up a thin column of white-gray smoke on the west-southwest horizon, just above a ridgeline that I recognized as the northeast shoulder of an unnamed summit I'd been calling Baldy in my journal because it was above treeline on its upper third. I swung the Aladad on the Osborne Firefinder and took the azimuth, 267 degrees, close enough to 268 that I wrote both readings in my log. I looked up the landmark reference, 9 miles west-southwest, approximately. Subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce at that elevation, south-facing slope. It was 9:42 in the morning. I stared at the smoke for a while before I called it in. My hands were steadier. I'm proud of that, looking back, even though it's a small thing. I keyed the radio. Methau Dispatch, this is Kettle Peak Lookout. I have a smoke report. Patty came on. Kettle Peak Lookout, go ahead with your smoke report. I read it off my notes. Azimuth 267 degrees from Kettle Peak. Estimated location, unnamed ridge, approximately 9 miles west-southwest. Subalpine fir and spruce, south-facing, upslope wind behavior, estimated 0.2 acres. Patty read it back, asked for my spotting potential assessment. I said moderate to high, based on the fuel type and aspect. She acknowledged, said she'd coordinate with the IC duty officer and get back to me. I stood at the Osborne Firefinder, and I looked at that smoke for a long time. It grew. By noon, it was closer to a half acre, and the spotting potential I'd estimated was proving accurate. You could see spot fires dropping out ahead of the main fire in the flammable ground cover below the tree line. A crew reached it by mid-afternoon, and it was contained at 3 acres by 1800 hours. But the smoke report I had filed read, Azimuth 268, 9 miles west-southwest, 0940, 0.2 acres, south-facing, spotting potential moderate to high. Initial attack resources requested. On July 7th, at 1:17 in the morning, a voice on my radio had read me this report. Almost exactly this report. Down to the spotting potential assessment. Down to the azimuth reading, off by 1 degree. I sat with this for several days. I want to be honest about this part because I think it's the part that sounds least credible when I tell it to other people. The fact that I didn't immediately spiral into fear or panic or start calling people. Instead, I went into something more like a methodical reconsideration of what I knew. What I knew was this. 5 days before a specific smoke appeared at a specific location, a radio transmission had described that smoke's characteristics accurately. The transmission was received at my station, on my radio, at 0117 hours. The transmission used standard Forest Service spot report format. The call sign given at the start of the report was Kettle Peak Lookout, my call sign. What I didn't know, whether the transmission had actually been coherent, or whether my sleeping brain had made it coherent in retrospect, whether I'd recorded any of it accurately, whether 267 and 268 was meaningful coincidence, or just degrees from adjacent azimuths of the same column of smoke. I spent 2 days arguing myself out of it. By the end of those 2 days, I had reduced the transmission to an unusual radio event, probably crosstalk, that happened to describe conditions broadly similar to a smoke I later spotted. The specifics I remembered might not be accurate, because I'd been half asleep. The azimuth might be a coincidence, because west-southwest of my tower was a long arc of terrain with similar fuel types and aspects. The time of day might be a coincidence, because fires ignited by overnight lightning often smolder and then pick up with the morning heating cycle. This was a reasonable reading. I chose to accept it because the alternative euro that my radio had transmitted a report of an event that hadn't happened yet was not something I could do anything useful with. I did write it down, not in the official logbook, where I tried to keep only operationally relevant information, but in my personal journal. I noted the date of the transmission, the date of the fire, the azimuth reading, and the estimated size at first contact. I noted the discrepancy, and I noted my decision to treat it as coincidence. Then I closed the journal and went back to my scans. What I had not done, and I'm aware of this, I'm aware of how the sequence matters, was open the old logbooks from the shelf. I'm not sure why I hadn't opened them. Frank had said I didn't need to read them, but I've read things I didn't need to read my entire career. You don't do engineering work without developing the habit of reviewing the record, even the old record, even the parts that theoretically don't matter. So why hadn't I? I think the honest answer is that I'd been comfortable. The first month had given me a rhythm I hadn't had since the layoff, and reading old logbooks felt like the kind of thing that might disturb something, which is not a good reason, but it's the real one. I opened them on the night of July 19th. The reason was insomnia. I'd woken at 2 and couldn't get back under, and the novels weren't holding me. I lay in the cot for a while, watching the stars through the south window. It was a clear night, and the stars were as dense as they get at that elevation. The Milky Way, a genuine visible feature across the sky, rather than the suggestion it is from lower elevations. And the effect should have been pleasant, but instead felt oppressive in the particular way that large things feel oppressive when you're already restless. Too much. Too big. I turned on the lantern and sat up. The cab was cold. I'd let the propane heater run down before sleep and hadn't relit it, and I pulled the sleeping bag around my shoulders and sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the room. The Osborne fire finder on its pedestal, the radio on its shelf, the cook stove, the small counter with its shallow metal sink, the shelf with the procedure manuals and the reference guides. The logbooks were sitting on the shelf above the sink, 3 green binders of different thicknesses, and I'd looked at them enough times by then that not picking one up finally felt stranger than picking one up. Frank had said I didn't need to read them, which was true, but was also the kind of thing that makes you think about something more rather than less. They'd been there the whole season, part of the room's background, and I'd been skirting around them the way you skirt around a conversation you're not ready to have. The most recent one was labeled on its spine in black marker, 2021 season/E Watts. The one before it was 2019 season/D Krebs. The earliest was a thin binder labeled 1987-88/R Paulton, which was older than the other two by enough years to suggest there had been other logbooks in between that were no longer here. I opened the 2021 binder first. Eddie Watts. His handwriting was compact and neat, the kind of handwriting that stays consistent even when you're tired. The first entries were what I expected: weather observations, smoke reports, equipment notes. Watts was clearly experienced. His observations were precise, and his spot reports were well organized. His entries on red flag days were thorough, with additional detail about wind shifts and RH changes that showed he understood fire behavior. He had a personal note column that he wrote in the margin, which wasn't standard but wasn't prohibited. The forms had wide left margins, and some lookouts used them for informal observations. His notes were laconic: grouse chick on catwalk, 3rd day running, Frank late. Radio check at 0900 instead of 0800. Cloud build to the east unusual checked. No moisture system incoming. About 6 weeks into his season, in early August by the dates, his marginal notes changed. The first one I noticed read, 0130 night reading on radio. Call sign unclear. FS format. Logged it. I turned a few pages. 3 days later, in the margin, crosstalk, 3rd occurrence, North Cascades District, checked with PO, no test transmissions, unusual frequencies. PO would be Patty Olson. More pages. Another week, the margin note, in slightly smaller writing as though he'd wanted to keep it quiet. Night readings, 4 incidents, all FS spot report format. Call sign given is Kettle Peak Lookout. Why would Kettle Peak call to Kettle Peak? This doesn't make sense. I set the binder down on the cot. I sat with that for a moment. The call sign given in the transmissions I'd heard had also been Kettle Peak Lookout. I had registered this at the time and filed it away as part of the general strangeness of the transmission, and now I was reading that the previous occupant of this same cab had noted the exact same thing. I picked the binder back up. More of Eddie Watts's entries, covering the rest of August, and his marginal notes continued. He'd begun tracking the transmissions more systematically. He had started A, and this is what got to me, comparing the reported locations with the actual incidents that followed. His notation was brief and factual. 812 trans, azimuth 312, NW Ridge. 814, smoke at NW Ridge, azimuth 311. Second incident, compare. 819 trans, described a hiker down in South Fork. 820, SAR callout, South Fork drainage. Third incident, compare. 827 trans, mentioned a FS road fire. 828, road maintenance vehicle fire, FS road 9140. Fourth. He had 4 confirmed cases, and then a 5th entry that stopped me entirely. 9/3 trans, 0215, voice is mine. That was the entire note. He'd underlined it. The next line, the next day's entry, was a regular weather observation: dry bulb 61 degrees, wet bulb 54, RH 72%, wind northwest at 6, normal. But his handwriting on that weather entry was slightly different, looser, less even, as though he'd written it in a state of something he hadn't shaken off yet. I kept reading. His final weeks of the season were otherwise mostly normal. He reported 2 more smokes. He noted some equipment maintenance. His marginal notes had stopped almost entirely after September 3rd. There were a few, but they were brief and practical. Radio battery at 60%, charged. Patty asked about my end-of-season paperwork. Frank up Thursday, brought the wrong oatmeal again. His last official entry was September 16th, a full month before the standard end of season. The entry noted weather and a clean scan with no smoke activity. In the margin, in the smallest writing I'd seen in the whole binder, he'd written, "I've decided to leave early. I'm going to call Patty in the morning and ask to be relieved. I don't think this is a safety issue. I don't know what I think it is." There was no September 17th entry. I closed the binder and set it on the cot and sat in the chair at the Osborne firefinder table for a while. Outside, the night was still, and the stars over the East Ridge were bright enough to wash out the Milky Way. I could hear nothing except the faint sound of the tower's metal contracting in the overnight cold, the small ticking that I'd stopped noticing after the second week. 9/3 trans, 0215, voice is mine. I'd had 4 confirmed night transmissions by this point, counting the one before the July 12th fire. I'd only just admitted to myself that the first one wasn't a coincidence. I had not yet heard my own voice on the radio. I want to be clear about what I was feeling at that moment. because I think it matters for what I decided to do afterward. I was not afraid, not exactly. I was the way you feel when you find a crack in a structural member that you haven't calculated yet. Your whole body shifts into a kind of hyper-alertness, not panic but urgency, the feeling of something that requires your full attention and doesn't care how tired you are. I picked up the second oldest logbook, the 2019 season, D. Krebs. I went through it looking for the marginal notes. David Krebs, I guessed at the first name, had a looser hand and wrote longer entries, more descriptive. His season had evidently been quieter on the fire front. He had more entries about wildlife observations, about the weather patterns, about books he was reading. He'd noted that there were 3 novels left in the cab from previous occupants, and he'd read 2 of them. He'd noted that the 1987 logbook on the shelf had entries by someone who'd apparently been stationed here the previous winter, which was unusual enough to comment on. His marginal notes were fewer, and had a different character from Watts's. He was less systematic. About 5 weeks into his season, in mid-July, I found weird radio thing last night trans at 0200, no ID, garbled FS format. Checked with Patty, she said ignore it. 2 weeks after that, second late trans, maybe the Sheelan district, something echoing. And then, near the end of his entries, a single margin note that was underlined twice. 9-1, heard my own name on the radio at midnight, David Krebs. Called in by name. I had not told anyone I was here except Patty and Frank. The transmission said my name, and an azimuth and a fire that wasn't burning. I've written to Glenn about it, and I'm leaving before the end of the month. His last entry was September 8th. I put that binder down. I didn't pick up the 1987 logbook that night. I sat in the chair until about 4 in the morning, thinking. Then I lay down and didn't sleep. At 0800 I called in my radio check, and Patty acknowledged. I had planned to tell her what I'd found. But when I keyed the radio and heard her voice, professional and even, I thought about what I was going to say, that I'd read the old logbooks and found accounts of the same anomalous radio transmissions I'd been experiencing, and that I wanted to talk about it. And I found that I didn't quite know how to put it together. There was a version of it that sounded like a system problem, frequencies, crosstalk, atmospheric effects. There was a version of it that sounded like I was struggling with the isolation. I said, Patty, I've had a couple of odd transmissions on the radio overnight. Late night, unidentified caller, FS format. Is there any chance there's a frequency overlap with another district that might be echoing up here? She said, what frequency were they transmitting on? I checked the radio. Looks like main district frequency. There was a pause, brief but present. I'll note it and check with the radio tech. Has it affected your equipment function? No. Okay. If it happens again, log the time and what you heard and I'll pass it along. Anything else? No. That's it. Thanks, Patty. Kettle Peak Lookout, clear. I sat with the radio in my hand after she signed off. She had sounded normal. She had sounded exactly the same as she always did, but she had not asked me what I had heard in those transmissions, other than confirming they were on the main frequency. She had not asked the obvious follow-up. What did the transmissions say? Who was the caller? That absence of curiosity might mean nothing. It might mean she was busy, or that she treated it as a radio tech issue outside her scope. But I'd been working with Patty on the radio for 5 weeks, and she was genuinely thorough. She asked follow-up questions. It was part of how she operated. I didn't record the conversation in my personal journal right away. I wanted to be sure I wasn't constructing something that wasn't there. I waited 2 days, going over it in my mind, before I wrote it down, and what I wrote was, Patty did not ask what the transmission said. The weather had been stable since the July 12th fire high pressure, light winds, visibility excellent, RH staying above 20% through the afternoon hours, which put us below red flag criteria. I found myself in long, clear days of scanning where my mind could move around freely, and mostly what it moved around was the question of what kind of thing I was dealing with. The engineering answer, the explanation built from things I could measure, was this. There was a source of radio transmission that I had not identified, operating on or near my district frequency, that was generating transmissions in Forest Service spot report format at irregular overnight intervals. The content of these transmissions correlated with fire events and emergency incidents that subsequently occurred in my area of coverage. The correlation was high enough across multiple incidents that it couldn't be explained by chance. That was the what. It didn't get me to the how. Radio doesn't transmit the future. I know that. I spent a fair amount of time in those long scanning days turning over possible mechanisms. The one I kept coming back to was some version of a recording playback, a device somewhere in my area of coverage that was playing back recordings of old transmissions. If the recordings were from different years, you might get approximate matches to current conditions, especially in a setting where fire behavior is constrained by geography and the same ridges burn in similar ways in similar fuel conditions. The azimuth would match because the geographical relationship between a recurring ignition source and the tower doesn't change year over year. But this didn't explain why Eddie Watts had heard his own voice, or why David Krebs had heard his own name, unless the recordings were recent enough to be from the same season, which would mean someone had to be making them and playing them back almost in real time. I was aware that I was building increasingly elaborate mechanisms to avoid the simpler conclusion, which was that something was transmitting descriptions of incidents before they happened. I didn't want to think that, not because it frightened me, though it did, but because it was a thought with no engineering path forward. If it was anomalous radio behavior, I could study frequencies and atmospheric conditions. If it was a recording device, I could try to find it. If it was something else, something that didn't have an explanation in the structure of the physical world as I understood it, then I was holding a problem with no tools available to solve it. I took the problem apart in smaller pieces instead. I decided to start keeping a precise record of every transmission. I got a small waterproof notepad from my gear and kept it beside the radio, with a pencil attached by a string. I wrote down the date, the time, and a verbatim transcript as best I could of anything I heard between midnight and 6 a.m. I also tried recording the transmissions. This seemed like the obvious thing to do once I'd committed to treating the phenomenon as real evidence. If I had an audio record, I could verify the content against the subsequent incidents in a way that ruled out false memory. My cell phone had a voice memo app, and the phone itself had a decent microphone. I started keeping it beside the notepad with the screen-off timer extended so it would stay on through the night. The first night I tried this was the night of July 31st, 2 days after the Timber Creek transmission. I went to sleep with the phone propped against the radio shelf, voice memo already running, and told myself I'd check the recording in the morning regardless of whether I'd heard anything. In the morning, there was 53 minutes of recording, from when I'd set it to when the battery had cut off Euro. I'd forgotten to plug it in. 53 minutes of the small sounds of the cab at night, the propane line ticking, occasional wind past the windows, one bout of snoring that I recognized as my own. No transmission. The phone had been working. The radio had been working. I'd set the memo to record the ambient room audio, and I'd gotten ambient room audio. I moved the phone closer to the radio speaker and tried again the following night, and got nothing again, or nothing relevant. On the night of August 3rd, the night before Frank's supply run, I woke at 01:27 to the radio clicking open. I was aware of it in the way I'd trained myself to be aware of it now. Not a startled waking, just a shift from sleep to alertness. The voice spoke for about 90 seconds, a short transmission that described a rockfall incident on a trail system south of the district boundary, dated August 7th. Personnel involved, recommended trail closure. I wrote it down, got most of it. When the transmission ended, I was wide awake, and I picked up the phone to check the memo. The recording was running. I could see the timer ticking. I set it to play back from about 2 minutes before the timestamp of the transmission. The playback gave me dead air. The small sounds of the room, the tick, the distant wind, and then exactly nothing where the transmission should have been. Not static, not noise, dead air. Then the room sounds resumed after the gap, which itself was the length of the transmission, give or take. I played it back 3 times to be sure. The gap was there. The gap was the right length. The transmission had been real enough to create a gap in the background noise of the room. The radio had put out sound that displaced the ambient, but the phone had not picked it up, or had picked it up as silence. I don't have an explanation for this that satisfies me. I've thought about whether the radio was using a frequency that the phone microphone was tuned to miss, but that's not how either of those devices work. I've thought about whether there was some kind of interference that affected the recording specifically, but the phone recorded everything else in the room accurately. What I have is a recording with a gap that's the exact right length and the exact right position in the timeline, and inside the gap, nothing. I described this to Frank during his supply visit on August 3rd, briefly, as one of several details I gave him. He listened without expression. He didn't have an explanation either, and he wasn't the kind of man to make one up. I also went back to the logbooks. The 1987-88 binder, the oldest one, was more fragile than the others. The cover was faded to a pale olive, and the spine had a crack at the top. Inside, the forms were older Forest Service issue, a slightly different layout, with different fields, but the information was the same. Temperature, humidity, wind, sky condition, smoke reports, equipment logs. The occupant was R. Paulton, the first name I couldn't determine. The handwriting was careful and old-fashioned, with slightly ornate capital letters. The season had apparently started in mid-June as well, and the entries ran through mid-September. R. Paulton had been here through a busier fire season. There were multiple smoke reports, and he appeared to have been heavily involved in directing resources to several significant fires in late August. His entries were almost entirely formal. No marginal notes, no personal asides. The discipline of an older tradition of record-keeping, or possibly just a different personality. I was almost to the end of the binder before I found anything. In the last 2 weeks of entries, in the very corner of the form, barely in the margin at all, written in slightly smaller letters than the rest of the handwriting, "The tower talks to itself at night." That was it. No context, no elaboration. 2 entries later, just a week before the end of the season, the same corner of the form, October, will ask about the old logs when I return to TWISP. This has happened before. There were no further entries. The season closed with a standard checkout note in different handwriting, probably Glenn's or a previous ranger's. Facility closed 9/22/1987. Equipment winterized per protocol. No damage noted. R. Paulton had apparently not been back the following season, because the next logbook after his was from 2019 with Krebs. I sat with that phrase for a long time. The tower talks to itself at night. It was precisely the kind of thing a certain kind of practical person would write to describe something they weren't prepared to name directly. The next night, I slept with the notepad beside the radio. I woke at a noise, whether it was an actual sound or my own hypervigilance, I'm not sure, at 0205, and lay still in the dark. Nothing. I lay there for an hour, listening, and fell back asleep. The night after, same thing. I woke once, listened, heard nothing, went back. On July 27th, the transmission came again. I was already awake when it started, at 1:12. I'd been lying in the cot in that state where you're not quite asleep, but not exactly alert either, when the radio clicked, the specific click of a signal opening a channel, and the voice came through. Male, even, no particular accent. I'd listened to Patty and Glenn and Frank enough by now to have good calibration for what Forest Service voices in this region sound like, and this was close, but not identical to any of them, slightly lower than Patty's radio voice. Not Glenn, who I'd spoken to twice by phone, not Frank, whose register was different. I had the notepad and pencil in my hand before the voice finished the second sentence. Smoke report, Kettle Peak Lookout, 29 July, 1420 hours. Azimuth 183 degrees from Kettle Peak. Estimated location, head of Timber Creek drainage, southeast aspect, approximately 11 miles south-southeast of Kettle Peak. Estimated size at initial report, 1 acre, transitioning to crown fire behavior. Heavy subalpine fir, continuous canopy. Spotting potential, high to extreme. Fire behavior, active crown fire. Rate of spread estimated 12 to 15 chains per hour, upslope and up canyon wind. Request immediate initial attack, at least 2 hand crews, 1 tanker. Lookout requests confirmation of air resources availability. One Forest Service employee reported in the Timber Creek area, please advise on contact and personnel accountability. Then quiet. The channel closed. I had filled most of the page on the notepad. I lay in the dark with the pencil in my hand and read back what I'd written, touching the words like I was checking their reality. July 29th, Southeast Aspect. 11 miles south-southeast. 1 acre transitioning to crown fire. 2 hand crews, 1 tanker. 1 FS employee in the area. Personnel accountability. This was more detailed than the previous transmissions I'd heard. The first one, back on July 7th, had been a fairly standard spot report. This one had additional detail, the crown fire transition, the rate of spread estimate, the specific resource request, the personnel accountability concern. I knew what personnel accountability meant in a fire context. It meant that someone might be in the area of the fire, might need to be accounted for, might be at risk. I didn't sleep after the transmission. At first light, I was at the Osborne Firefinder with the notepad, matching my notes to the map. Timber Creek drainage was clearly marked, about 11 miles to my south-southeast. The terrain there was consistent with the description, a canyon with a creek at the bottom, heavy fir on the upper slopes, continuous canopy for most of the upper drainage. I noted the azimuth, 183 degrees, meaning just west of due south. I recorded the transmission, verbatim from my notes, in my personal journal. Then I sat at the table and watched the southern quadrant. July 28th passed without incident in the south-southeast. I called in my weather obs, did my scans, saw nothing. The weather was warm and dry but not extreme H in the mid-20s by afternoon. Wind light from the west. No red flag warning active. July 29th was different. By 1000, the RH was at 18% and dropping. The wind had shifted to southwest overnight, which brought in drier air, and by noon it was picking up €. I estimated 15 miles per hour in gusts. The temperature was pushing 90, which was high for the elevation but not unheard of. At 1200, I called Patty and told her we were approaching red flag criteria. She said the district had issued a fire weather watch and was monitoring. At 1347, I picked up the smoke. It was already significant when I spotted it, not the thin white column of a fresh start, but a gray-brown boiling mass coming up out of the upper Timber Creek drainage, the specific color of heavy timber burning, with a lot of moisture still in the larger fuels, and plenty of dry, fine fuel feeding the active portion. I recognized crown fire behavior immediately. The fire was moving through the canopy rather than along the ground, and you could see the speed of it in the way the smoke column was building at its base. It wasn't standing still. I got to the Osborne Firefinder. The azimuth read 182 degrees from my position, 1 degree off from the transmission, in the opposite direction from the July 12th fire, which had been 1 degree off the other way. I keyed the radio, went through the spot report format, gave Patty everything I had. When I mentioned the crown fire behavior and the rate of spread, she immediately escalated the call to the district duty officer. Resources were ordered. The response was significant: 2 hand crews, a helicopter, a tanker aircraft, and an engine crew. The IC was a Type 2 team from Wenatchee. At one point during the afternoon, Patty came back to me and said they had an FS employee in the area, a timber sale administrator, who'd been doing a stand exam in the lower drainage that morning, and asked if I could see any movement on the lower trail that might be consistent with his evacuation route. I couldn't see the lower trail. I told her so, but I reported that the fire was moving up canopy toward the upper drainage, and that if he was in the lower creek bottom, the smoke wouldn't be directly overhead yet. She acknowledged and went off to coordinate the personnel accountability. The timber sale administrator got out. The fire burned 340 acres before it was contained 4 days later. While I was watching the smoke on the afternoon of July 29th, I wrote in my personal journal, my notepad says 183, the finder says 182, FS employee in the area, personnel accountability. This is the 3rd time. By this point, the rational explanation box in my mind was getting difficult to fill. Not impossible, I could still argue, technically, that I was recognizing patterns in crosstalk from archived recordings, or that there was some kind of equipment echo, or that my memory of the transmissions was being shaped by the events that followed them. But each alternative required adding more assumptions, more mechanisms, more elaborate invisible machinery. The simpler explanation that something was transmitting descriptions of fires and emergencies before they happened kept becoming simpler, while the alternatives kept becoming more complicated. I thought about leaving. I want to be honest about that. I sat on the catwalk on the evening of July 29th, watching the smoke column from the Timber Creek fire going orange in the sunset light, the aircraft tanker making its last run of the day, and I thought about calling Patty in the morning and telling her I wanted out. I had enough reason. The anomalous transmissions were real and documented. The previous occupants had both left early, one of them explicitly citing the radio phenomenon. I was not under any particular obligation to stay and figure this out. But I didn't want to leave without understanding it. And I was aware that if I left without understanding it, I would think about it for years. It had already taken on the particular quality of an unresolved engineering problem, the kind that wakes you at 3 in the morning, not because it's frightening, but because your brain keeps running the calculation and not getting a result. I stayed. I called Frank's number on my cell phone from the northwest catwalk corner the next morning. I'd had Frank's number since orientation Euro. He'd given it to me as a contact for supply questions, and said I could text him if the supply list changed between the scheduled call-ins. I'd texted him twice before about supply items, but this was the first time I'd called him. He picked up on the 4th ring. He sounded like he was in a truck. I could hear road noise. I said, "Frank, this is Tom at Kettle Peak. I had a question I wanted to ask you off the radio, if that's okay." He said, "Go ahead." I said, "The person who was here before me, Eddie Watts, do you know why he left early?" A pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then said he had a family thing. That's what he told Patty. Did he say anything to you? Another pause. Why are you asking, Tom? I found his logbook. He mentioned some radio issues. I've been having similar things, and I was wondering if they were related. The road noise in the background continued. Frank didn't say anything for a few seconds, and when he did speak, his voice had changed slightly. It wasn't evasive exactly, but it had become more careful. "Eddie's a good man," he said. "He was here 2 seasons back, and he did good work. He left early, and I drove him out, and we didn't talk much on the way down, and that's about all I know." "What about the 2019 person, Krebs?" "Same thing. Left before end of season." "Did they say why?" "Family thing," he said. And then, immediately after, radio issues. There was a flatness to that answer, like he'd given the official version first, and then corrected it to the real version without meaning to. I said, "Have you heard about this before? These radio things?" "Tom." He said my name the way someone says a name when they're deciding something. "I drive the supply truck. I'm not the district ranger." "I know that." "I'm going to be up Thursday," he said, meaning the regular resupply the day after tomorrow. "We can talk when I'm there." He hung up before I could respond. I stood on the catwalk with the phone in my hand and watched a hawk working a thermal off the east ridge, rising in slow spirals, and thought about what family thing/radio issues in that sequence had meant, and what the way he'd said my name had meant, and what "we can talk when I'm there" meant. I went back inside and wrote it all down. The 2 days before Frank arrived were clear and hot. I stayed on my scanning routine, made my OBS calls, watched the Timber Creek fire's smoke column to the south as the crews worked it. Patty gave me updates during the 1,600 calls. The fire was 60% contained, then 80%, then full containment on the morning of the 31st. I watched the smoke fade from a rolling brown column to a thin white wisp that disappeared entirely by noon. I also, on the evening of July 30th, picked up the 1987 logbook again and read it more carefully. R. Paulton. I still didn't know the first name, and the initials didn't help. The R could be anything. The handwriting told me a certain amount. Careful, practiced, the handwriting of someone who had been writing technical reports for a long time. His weather obs were exact to the decimal euro. He never rounded his wet bulb readings the way I sometimes did when I was tired. His smoke reports were clean. He was good at the job. Reading the 1987 entries in detail, I noticed things I'd missed the first time through. He'd been here from June through late September, and the first month and a half was entirely unremarkable. In August, he reported 3 smokes, one of which grew to several hundred acres before it was contained. His spot reports on that fire were thorough and accurate. Then, starting in late August, his entries began to show a very slight difference in character. Not anything you'd notice if you weren't looking for it. His weather obs were the same. His scans were the same. But his timing was slightly off. Weather obs that should be logged at 1000 and 1600 were being logged at 1007, 11612, 1003, 1615. Small delays, the kind that happen when something is pulling your attention. There was one entry, August 28, 1987, where he had written the weather obs information, then written the smoke report section for a smoke I could cross-reference from the narrative entry-o. He'd spotted a small smoke in the late afternoon, called it in, it was handled and then below the smoke report, in the same careful handwriting but in smaller letters, in the space reserved for notes, received transmission at 0340 on 827. Did not recognize call sign, male voice. Reported a fire at approximately the same location as the smoke I spotted today. Reporting now, in case it is relevant. That was it. And then his final notation, a week later, in the corner. The tower talks to itself at night, and then the one about asking about the old logs. He'd been here in 1987. It was now 2023. 36 years later, and whatever R. Paulton had experienced in late August 1987 had also been experienced by David Krebs in 2019 and Eddie Watts in 2021, and was now being experienced by me. The question of what I was dealing with had been getting harder to avoid. I'd been approaching it like an engineering problem, unknown system, measurable outputs, looking for the mechanism, but there are problems that don't have mechanisms accessible to the methods you're applying, and eventually you have to acknowledge that. I was approaching that point. I did not accept anything supernatural. I want to be careful about this. I don't use that word. What I accepted was this. There was a phenomenon occurring at Kettle Peak Lookout that I did not understand, that had been occurring for at least 36 years, that correlated precisely with real incidents, and for which I had no conventional explanation. That was the limit of what I could honestly say. Frank arrived on Thursday, August 3rd, at around 1300. I heard him on the trail while I was doing my midday scan, the particular sound of a pack frame against brush, the rhythmic footfall of someone who knows the terrain. I watched from the catwalk as he came out above tree line a quarter-mile down and crossed the open slope. He was moving at his usual pace, unhurried, carrying what looked like a heavier pack than usual. He came up the stairs without calling ahead, which he'd always done. I had the trapdoor propped open, and he came through without ceremony, put his pack down on the floor, and stood looking at the room for a moment before he looked at me. "Supply run," he said, and we went through the ritual of unpacking and stowing the new provisions. Propane canisters under the counter, food items to the shelf, fresh water jugs to the cistern shed, spare batteries to the equipment drawer. He'd brought the right oatmeal this time, which felt like a minor act of consideration. When everything was stowed, he took the wooden chair, and I sat on the cot. He pulled out a thermos of coffee that he'd brought from below and poured 2 cups into the cups on the counter. The coffee was hot and good. "What radio things?" he said. Not a question. He'd been thinking about it since I called. I told him. I started from the beginning. The first transmission on July 7th. The dismissal of it, the July 12th fire, the comparison with my notes, the transmissions since. I told him about Watts's logbook and Krebs's logbook, and what I'd found in the 1987 binder. I told him about the 1-degree azimuth differences. I told him about the Timber Creek fire and the personnel accountability call and how it had matched the transmission 2 days before. He listened without interrupting. He drank his coffee. When I was done, he poured himself another cup and looked out the south window toward the ridge where Timber Creek drained. "How long have you known about this?" I said. "Known what, exactly?" "That this happens here." He turned the cup in his hands. I've been driving the supply truck for this district for 14 years. This tower and 2 others. In that time, I've had 4 people in this cabin. 2 of them left before end of season. One of them I had to drive out in September after a conversation that wasn't a great conversation. He paused. The one before them, Krebs, I drove out in 2019. He was fine. He was just done. He told me what he'd been hearing, and he said he was going, and that was that. Did any of them file a formal incident report? Krebs mentioned it to Patty. Glenn talked to him by phone. The official record says, equipment anomaly, unresolved. They brought a radio tech up in September 2019 to check the gear, and he said there was nothing wrong with the equipment. And the tower before Krebs? Frank looked at me. This tower's been shut down twice since I've been here. Once in Euro. He thought about it. 2006, and once earlier, around 2011, I think. Both times the official reason was equipment issues. Both times they brought a tech up and found nothing wrong. The second time, they were closed for 2 seasons. When they reopened, did the person they put here experience the same thing? First person after 2011 didn't report anything. Second person, he paused. Left early. Same story. I said, have you experienced it? He looked at me again, and this time his expression had something in it that was difficult to read. Not fear. Closer to the expression of a person who has decided how much of something to say and is trying to get exactly to that line without going over. I've been in this cab maybe 40 times, he said. I come up, drop supplies, check the equipment. Sometimes I stay for a cup of coffee, sometimes longer if the weather's closing in and I need to wait it out. I've never spent a night here. That's not an answer. He almost smiled. No, it's not. He set down his cup and looked at his hands. Twice, when I've been walking up the trail early in the morning, before the lookout person was up, I've heard something on the radio, through the window, from outside. I didn't go in. I waited on the catwalk until it was done. And I don't think about it, he said. That's not evasion, it's just I'm the supply driver. I'm not equipped to think about it. I understood this. There are problems that sit outside your job description in a way that isn't about reluctance. You hand them to whoever's equipped to handle them, and if nobody seems to be, you find a way to live alongside them. Is there anyone who knows more about this? I said. Glenn? Someone at the regional office? Frank shook his head slowly. Glenn knows the tower has a history. He was here in 2011 when it was closed, but I think what Glenn knows and what Glenn will officially say are different things. He stood up, picked up his empty thermos. I'll tell you what I told Eddie Watts. You can stay and you can go. If you want to go, call Patty. She'll arrange it. No questions. Nobody's going to think badly of you. What did Eddie decide? He stayed another week and a half after I talked to him. Then he called Patty on a Monday, and he was off the hill by Wednesday. Did you talk to him on the way out? Frank put the thermos in his pack and buckled it closed. He was quiet for a moment, adjusting the shoulder straps. I talked to him, he said finally. He was all right. He was just quiet. He said there was a night toward the end where the transmission was so specific that Frank stopped and rearranged whatever he'd been about to say. He said he was ready to go home. That's all he said. Frank went down the stairs. I watched him cross the open slope from the catwalk and disappear into the tree line, and then I stood out there for a while with the wind coming from the northwest and the country spread out around me in all directions. I thought about what Frank had said. You can stay and you can go. It was more than a simple offer. It was a kind of institutional acknowledgement that the staying or going was a decision that mattered, one that the institution knew about without quite being willing to look at directly. I thought about R. Paulton asking about the old logs when he returned to Twisp. I thought about whether he'd ever asked and what the answer had been if he did. I stayed. I'm still not entirely sure why. Part of it was that leaving felt like the choice made by someone who had given up on understanding, and I hadn't given up. Part of it was that the alternative, going back to Danny's spare bedroom with no income and the property division still unresolved, felt worse than whatever was happening up here. At least up here, the fear had a location. It was on the radio. It was in the night. I could point at it. The weeks between Frank's visit and the next transmission were the most ambivalent of the season. The fire weather eased, and I had long, clear days with good visibility and minimal smoke activity. In one sense, this was the job going well. In another sense, it left me with a lot of unstructured hours and a question I'd committed to staying with, and that combination is not easy to live inside. I thought about the mechanisms more than I should have. Not in a productive way, not engineering thinking, where you're systematically ruling out possibilities and moving toward an answer, but in the obsessive circular way that happens when your mind has committed more resources to a problem than the available data can support. I'd lie on the cot in the afternoon with the windows open and the breeze coming through, and I'd go back over the azimuth discrepancy, the 1-degree difference that appeared consistently across all confirmed events. It bothered me more than the transmissions themselves, in a way. The transmissions were impossible. But something impossible that's always exactly 1 degree wrong has a quality of precision that feels intentional, and intentional implies an intent, and intent implies something that has intentions. I was aware I was anthropomorphizing a radio phenomenon. I noted this in the journal. I kept doing it anyway. I also thought about the structure of what was being transmitted. The voice didn't editorialize. It didn't explain itself. It didn't say, "I'm contacting you from the future. Here is a warning." It just read reports, in standard format, in the register of someone doing professional work carefully. There was nothing spectacular about the transmissions, and that was one of the things that made them so difficult to dismiss. A dramatic voice in the night saying something prophetic would be easy to write off as a dream or a waking hallucination. But a calm voice reading azimuth readings and grid references and spotting potential assessments in exactly the format and vocabulary of the job you were doing, that had a texture of reality that was harder to explain away. I tried calling the Forest Service radio technician directly in early August. I'd found his number in the equipment binder that had been in the cab since at least 2019, along with a service record showing the last maintenance visit. His name was Ken Pollock, and he worked out of the regional office in Wenatchee. I called from the catwalk in the cellular zone, introduced myself, and said I was the lookout at Kettle Peak and I'd been having some unusual reception on the main district frequency at night. He was friendly and professional and asked me to describe what I was hearing. I said I was hearing what sounded like spot reports in standard FS format, male voice, no identified call sign originating the transmission, receiving on the primary frequency. He asked if I'd noted the timestamp, and I said yes, multiple times, always between midnight and 2 a.m. He was quiet for a moment, and then asked whether the content of what I heard was anything I could describe. I said it was standard spot report format, accurate location data, fire behavior descriptions. He said that was an unusual description for spurious VHF reception, which tended to produce fragmented audio rather than coherent structured content. I asked if he'd heard of this type of reception phenomenon at this specific location before. He said, "Oh, Fern, and I want to be precise about this because the phrasing mattered." He said, "I'm familiar with the reception history at Kettle Peak." Not that he'd heard of this phenomenon generally, that he was familiar with the reception history at Kettle Peak specifically. Then he said he'd make a note and pass it to the district engineer, and he was professional and friendly when he said goodbye, and when I tried to call him again 3 days later, the number rang out without going to voicemail, and I never reached him again. Familiar with the reception history at Kettle Peak. That was a specific thing to say. It implied a history. It implied records. It implied that he had been told about this before, which meant it had gone somewhere in the bureaucracy, which meant there was a chain of information that connected what Paulton had experienced in 1987 to what I was experiencing now, and that chain had apparently not produced any intervention or explanation or public acknowledgement. I wrote it down in the journal. Pollock, Ken, FS Radio Tech Wenatchee, said familiar with reception history at Kettle Peak. Could not reach again. I thought about it for a few days, and then tried to find Pollock's contact through the Forest Service website. What I found was a regional radio services contact listed as vacant, pending hire. I sent an email to the General Radio Services address that bounced back as undeliverable. After this, I stopped pursuing the institutional angle for a while. It was clear enough that there was a body of institutional knowledge about this tower, and it was equally clear that the body of knowledge was not accessible to me, and spending energy on bureaucratic dead ends was not a useful way to spend the time I had remaining. I went back to the work. I scanned. I filed my obs. I ate oatmeal and read whatever held my attention, and watched the light change on the ridges and waited. The third week of August was busy with fire weather. We had a stretch of days in the upper 80s, with afternoon thunderstorms developing over the higher peaks and producing lightning-caused ignitions across the region. I was fully occupied during this period. Multiple smoke reports, coordination with Patty during active resource dispatches, continuous scanning during critical hours. I was good at the job by now in a way I hadn't been in June. I could read the smoke character more quickly, could estimate rate of spread from the behavior of the column, could anticipate where a fire would move based on the terrain and the wind. During this stretch, I heard nothing on the radio at night. No transmissions. 2 weeks without a single anomalous contact. I slept better than I had in weeks. I began to think cautiously, the way you think about a stopped water leak, that maybe it was done. Maybe whatever produced the transmissions had some kind of cycle or some dependency on conditions I hadn't identified, and those conditions had passed. On August 19th, the weather settled, and I had a clear, quiet day and a clear, quiet night, and no transmissions. On August 22nd, at 0048, the radio opened and the voice spoke. I had the notepad. I was awake. Not because anything had woken me, just awake, lying in the cot, looking at the dark ceiling, and when the click came, I had the pencil in my hand before the voice finished its first phrase. Smoke report, Kettle Peak Lookout, 26 August, 10:30 hours. Azimuth, 321 degrees from Kettle Peak. Estimated location, ridge west of Willow Creek Saddle, approximately 6 miles northwest of Kettle Peak. Estimated size, 0.1 acres, surface fire, slow-moving, fuel-limited. Ponderosa pine with bunchgrass understory. Spotting potential, low. No immediate resource request, recommend monitor. Additional note, fire appears to be a relight from the August 14th Saddle Creek fire, same ridge aspect, same drainage. Pause. Secondary report, maintenance crew has been advised to hold on FS Road 9140, pending aircraft overflight. Crew vehicles, 2. Crew size, 4. Contact frequency, 74.6. Pause. Then, in a very slightly different cadence, still the same voice, but with a quality I'd heard before in radio communications when someone was reading from a different document. Personnel note, this report was verified by Lookout at Kettle Peak at 13:30 hours. No change in fire behavior observed by 13:30. Lookout will continue to monitor through end of day. Then silence. I was still in the cot, on my back, with the notepad propped on my knee. I looked at what I'd written. August 26th, Azimuth 321, Willow Creek Saddle. Relight from August 14th fire. The August 14th Saddle Creek fire was real. I'd reported it, a small lightning-ignited fire on the west ridge that had been reached by a crew and declared contained at 0.3 acres. I'd watched the smoke for 2 days and it had gone out. But contained didn't always mean fully dead, especially in older fuels, and relight from a contained fire was a recognized hazard. The additional details were different from previous transmissions. The maintenance crew information, the contact frequency, the personnel note that included a reference to me, the lookout verifying the report at 13:30. These were details that went beyond a spot report into something more like an operational log for the entire incident. And the transmission date, August 26th, 4 days away. I wrote everything down carefully and accurately, then read it back twice to check it against my initial notes. I got up and looked at the Osborne Firefinder map, found Willow Creek Saddle. The azimuth from my position would be roughly northwest of Euro. Yes, 320 to 325, consistent with the reported 321. I checked the August 14th fire location in my logbook. The contained Saddle Creek fire had been on a ridge on the west side of the drainage, southwest facing ponderosa and bunchgrass. A relight in that fuel type, moving slowly in light winds, would be exactly fuel limited, exactly the character described. The spotting potential assessment of low was correct for surface fire in sparse bunchgrass with low density. I sat at the table with my logbook open and the notepad beside it, and I felt something that wasn't fear and wasn't wonder exactly. It was closer to the feeling I get when a calculation finally resolves, not triumph, just the recognition that the numbers are consistent with each other. The transmissions were not random. They were not crosstalk from unrelated traffic. They described, with operational precision, events that would happen at this specific location in the geographic area I was responsible for monitoring. The question I kept finding myself unable to answer was not what kind of thing this was. It was who was transmitting. The voice was calm, consistent, male, professional. It knew the local geography. It knew the call signs. It used correct Forest Service terminology and format. It referenced specific events from this specific season. It was not generic, not a rehearsal, not a test of some kind. It was operational. On August 25th, I pointed the binoculars northwest toward the Willow Creek Saddle area for most of my afternoon scanning block and saw nothing. The weather was clear, wind from the northwest at about 10 knots, RH in the mid-20s. Classic late August conditions in the eastern Cascades, the kind of days when old contained fires sometimes open back up. August 26th, I was at the Osborne Firefinder at 9:50. At 10:23, I picked up the smoke. Willow Creek Saddle, northwest. I swung the Aladad 320 degrees from Kettle Peak, 1 degree off. Every single time, 1 degree off. I had started to wonder if there was a systematic bias somewhere in my measurement technique, in the Aladad calibration, that consistently produced this 1 degree discrepancy. I'd checked the calibration against the known azimuth to a benchmark peak twice. It was correct. I called it in to Patty, gave the spot report, noted it as a probable relight from the August 14th fire. She agreed with that assessment, said she'd get a crew to check it. She mentioned there was a road maintenance crew on FS Road 9140 near the Western District boundary, and asked if I could verify they were clear of the fire area. I confirmed that the fire appeared to be on the ridge above the road level, and they should be able to hold in place pending air assessment. At 13:12, Patty came back and asked me to verify fire behavior. I looked through the binoculars, no change. I told her, "Lookout confirms no change in fire behavior. As of 13:12, fire appears stable. Will continue to monitor through end of day." Patty repeated that back for the log. I acknowledged. I then looked at my notepad. The transmission had said, "Lookout will continue to monitor through end of day." My actual words to Patty had been, "Will continue to monitor through end of day." Same phrasing. I'd said the same thing the transmission had predicted I'd say. My own words. I sat down in the wooden chair with the notepad in my hands and looked at those words for a while. What the transmission had included wasn't just a description of an event. It had included a description of my response to the event. My phrasing in the transmission's version wasn't close, it was exact. There are a limited number of ways to interpret that. The most obvious one, that the transmission was somehow recording my future words and playing them back in advance, makes no sense within any physics I understand. The second possibility, that the transmission used conventional language for conventional situations, and my response was also conventional, producing an apparent match, is plausible, except that "will continue to monitor through end of day" is a specific phrasing choice, not a formulaic one. The third possibility, which I spent the most time on in the days that followed, was that the transmissions weren't predicting my future behavior, but describing it in a way that influenced me to match the description. That I'd heard those words at 0048 on August 22nd, retained them subconsciously, and then replicated them in my radio call on August 26th, without realizing I was doing it. I am a rational person, and I try to apply Occam's razor to problems. The fourth possibility, which was also the simplest, was that the transmissions were somehow coming from the future. My future. The lookout at Kettle Peak in the future, filing reports that were somehow being received by the lookout at Kettle Peak in the past. I wrote all 4 interpretations in my journal. I assigned each one a probability based on consistency with the evidence. Even being generous to the first 3, the 4th one kept winning. I did not call Patty. I did not call Glenn. I did not call Frank, though I thought about it. What I would have told them was clear in my own mind. I would have laid out the evidence in the same order I'm laying it out here, but I had no idea how it would be received, and I wasn't ready to find out. Watts had mentioned it to Patty. Krebs had mentioned it to Glenn. Both of them had ultimately left. Whatever had been done with their reports, the official version was equipment anomaly, unresolved, hadn't produced any investigation I could find evidence of. Maybe reporting it was what you did when you were ready to leave, and I wasn't ready to leave yet. I want to explain why, though I'm aware it will sound strange given the circumstances. Since I'd arrived at Kettle Peak in June, the transmissions had described 4 events accurately, with azimuth readings within 1 degree, with fire behavior assessments that matched, with personnel details that proved accurate, with my own phrasing quoted back to me in advance. The correlation was not a coincidence. I'd accepted that by August, but nothing bad had happened. Whatever was transmitting whatever it was, however it worked, it hadn't lied, hadn't misled, hadn't caused harm. It had transmitted accurate operational information early. A cynical reading of that fact might be, it was giving me enough advance notice to do my job properly, which kept me useful, which kept me here. But even granting that cynical reading, my job being done properly kept things from burning down and kept people safe. The Timber Creek fire had not hurt the timber sale administrator, in part because Patty had a personnel accountability concern baked into the response. I couldn't say the transmission had saved his life, but I also couldn't say it hadn't. So I stayed, and I watched, and I took careful notes. September came in cold, the way it does in the Cascades. The big afternoon thunderstorm pattern broke in the first week and was replaced by a marine influence from the west, bringing high clouds and occasional light rain that knocked the fire danger down considerably. The scanning days felt different. Lower light, different color to the country, the larch on the east ridges starting their first yellow tinge that would peak in October. With the fire danger down, the scanning days had a different quality. I was still watching, still making my OBS calls, still doing everything I'd been doing since June. But the urgency of the high fire weather weeks had lifted, and what replaced it was something closer to the atmosphere I'd had in early July before the first transmission Euro. A spacious, unhurried quality that I'd have found pleasant if I hadn't been spending most of my attention on a question I couldn't answer. I went back through my records in the first week of September. I had 5 confirmed transmission event pairs, the 2 partial match transmissions I'd categorized as probable, and the August 3rd transmission about the rockfall incident on the Southern Trail, which I'd looked up in the district report after the fact and confirmed had happened on August 7th, a minor incident. 2 hikers had to be assisted out after a section of trail gave way above a steep section. That made 8. 8 incidents where the radio had described, with operational precision, something that subsequently happened. 8 incidents across one summer. If the pattern held and there was no reason to think it wouldn't, it had been holding since at least 1987. Possibly since 1933, when the tower was built, though I had no way to know. There were no logbooks from before 1987 on the shelf. Whether they'd been removed, or whether they'd never existed, or whether the phenomenon had only started at some point after construction, I couldn't say. I found myself thinking about R. Paulton a lot in those September days. The handwriting in that 1987 binder was the handwriting of a disciplined, careful person. The things he'd chosen to put in the official record were always the things he could objectively support: measurements, observations, incident reports. The one margin note, "The tower talks to itself at night," was a departure from his usual economy of language, and it read like someone who had thought carefully about what to write and settled on the most literal description he could make. The tower talks to itself. Not, "I heard strange things," not, "the radio produced anomalous output." The tower. As though the phenomenon was a property of the structure itself, rather than of any external source. I also thought about what talks to itself might mean if you took it literally. A system that generates output that loops back to become its own input. A feedback structure, closed, self-referential. In electronics, you'd call it a resonance. In control systems, you'd call it a closed loop with no external reference signal. A closed loop that, somehow, produces accurate predictions of external events. This didn't help. I noted it anyway. My original contract ran to September 22nd, and I had no financial urgency to leave early. The property settlement had come through in mid-August. My share was enough to cover rent for several months while I found a job, and the job market had, according to Danny, improved slightly. A county in central Washington was advertising for a transportation engineer. I'd been thinking about applying. September 11th. I found myself making notes about what I'd report to Glenn at the end of season and how I'd structure it. I thought about the old logbooks, about Paulton and Krebs and Watts, and what had or hadn't been done with their accounts, and I thought about whether my account would matter more because it was more thoroughly documented. I had dates, azimuths, transcriptions of the transmissions, confirmed correlating incidents with timestamps. I had the note from Ken Pollock about being familiar with the reception history. I had the failed recording with its gap of exactly the right length. I thought it would at least be something. Even if nobody could explain it, a detailed record from another occupant, cross-referencing the other records in the old logbooks, might constitute enough accumulated evidence that someone would have to take it seriously. I'd seen this in county work, how something could be an open secret in a department for years, everyone knowing about a drainage problem or a load rating discrepancy, until enough documentation accumulated in enough reports that it became impossible to maintain the pretense of not knowing. I thought maybe this was the same kind of thing, a paper record accumulating towards some threshold where the Forest Service would have to acknowledge what was here. I understood, as I wrote this in the journal, that I might be wrong about that. The record had been accumulating since at least 1987, and the response had been inspections that found nothing and silence afterward. Maybe there was no threshold. Maybe the institutional response was not about insufficient evidence, but about something else entirely. About what acknowledging this would mean, about what it would require the institution to say about the nature of the place and of time and of the radio signals passing through mountain air. These were not engineering thoughts. I noted them anyway. September brought Frank up one more time, the second Thursday of the month. The fire season was winding down far enough that he'd reduced the supply quantities, less food, only 2 propane canisters instead of 4. Water was fine. The autumn rain had kept the cistern topped. He came up and we worked through the unloading and stowing in the same companionable silence we'd developed, and I made coffee and he sat in the chair and I sat on the cot, same as the previous visit. He asked how I was doing, not in the supply driver way, in the genuine way. I said I was fine, which was more or less true by then. The acute discomfort of the mid-season period, the weeks of carrying the question without a place to put it, had resolved into something more like accommodation. I didn't know what the transmissions were. I'd probably never know. I'd decided, somewhere around the first week of September, that not knowing was going to have to be something I could live with, because the alternative continuing to push on a system that was clearly designed to absorb and deflect this specific inquiry was going to wear me down faster than the uncertainty would. Frank nodded when I said I was fine. He'd heard the same thing from people who weren't, and he could probably tell the difference. He seemed to accept it. He told me that the tower would be closed after my season ended, not for any specific reason, but because the district was evaluating whether to keep staffing seasonal lookouts or to move to camera systems. Several other towers in the region had already made the transition. The cameras were less effective in the rain and in smoke conditions, Frank said, with the mild disdain of someone who had been packing supplies up mountain trails his entire career and had opinions about mechanized alternatives. But they were cheaper, and they didn't leave. I thought about that last phrase. They didn't leave. I thought about whether that was actually an advantage for whatever was happening at this tower, or whether it was a complication. A camera couldn't hear a radio transmission. A camera couldn't be disturbed by a voice in the night. Whatever was happening here might become invisible, or might find another way to manifest, or might just continue, in the dark cab with no one to hear it, broadcasting its reports of fires and incidents and personnel accountability calls to an empty room. This thought bothered me more than I expected it to. I wrote it in the journal that night. If there's no one up here to receive the transmissions, does it still transmit? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. I did not expect what happened on the night of September 14th. I had gone to sleep at about 10:30, which was late for me by that point in the season. The nights were cold now, down into the upper 30s by midnight, and I was sleeping in a fleece liner inside the sleeping bag. The cab held heat better than I'd expected. The propane heater on a low setting kept it above 50, but there was always a chill at the windows, especially the north window, and I'd taken to piling my jacket over the sleeping bag at the foot of the cot. I woke at 00:37, not gradually, immediately, fully awake, lying on my back in the dark. The radio clicked. The voice came through. Smoke report? No. A brief pause. The same voice, the familiar even male register. This is a note. Another pause. September 15th. End of season report. Kettle Peak Lookout. I was sitting up on the cot. I had the notepad from Reflex, the pencil in my hand, though I could barely see the page. The voice continued. Lookout occupant departure. Scheduled for Euro. Pause. September 19th. 4 days early. Requested by occupant. Personal item left in cab. 1 green pocket notebook. Write in the Rain brand. 48 pages. Left under the cot in the storage space on the right side, against the back wall. I stopped breathing. I am not exaggerating this. My chest stopped, and my hands stopped moving, and the pencil was still on the page, and I was not breathing. I had a green Write in the Rain notebook. I had 2 of them, in fact both 48-page, both the standard pocket size. I'd bought a 4-pack before coming up, and used 2 of them for my personal journal through the season. The third one, partially filled, was what I was writing in now. The fourth one, unused, was in my gear bag under the cot. I had not thought about leaving on September 19th. I had not decided to leave on September 19th. My contract end date was September 22nd. I had not planned to leave any notebook in the cab. The voice continued. End of season equipment check complete. No deficiencies. No outstanding maintenance issues. Cistern at 40% capacity. Battery bank at 85%. Propane supply, approximately 3 weeks remaining at current usage. No fires active in coverage area at time of departure. Standard end-of-season inventory language. I was able to write some of it down now because my hand had started moving again. Additional note, filed with this report. Pause. The cadence here changed slightly. The reading tempo slowed. The lookout at Kettle Peak Lookout experienced anomalous radio transmissions throughout the 2023 season. 11 confirmed incidents, matching subsequent fire events and emergency calls. Full record is maintained in the lookout's personal journal, which is being retained by the occupant. The occupant has documented these incidents thoroughly and is encouraged to report them to the district ranger. Another pause. Longer. The lookout is Tom. He did good work. The channel closed. I sat in the dark for a very long time. The notepad was in my lap. I did not look at it. The cab was quiet, except for the faint tick of the cooling propane line and the Raven, somewhere below, making a sound I'd never heard it make at night before. He did good work. 11 confirmed incidents. I counted mine in my head. I'd had 5 transmissions with confirmed correlating events by my count in July 7th/12th, July 27th/29th, August 22nd/26th, and 2 smaller ones in between that I documented in the journal but hadn't told anyone about. Not 11, 5, which meant there were 6 more incidents to come between now and September 19th. I am trying to be precise and honest in everything I write here, and I want to be precise and honest about this. The phrase, "he did good work," affected me in a way I was not prepared for. I don't have a good explanation for this. Technically, it was the most mundane thing in the transmission, but I had spent 11 months by that point since the layoff, through the divorce, through the couch surfing at Danny's, through the application process, and the 3 days in TWISP, and the long walks up and down this trail, and the weeks of scans and OBS calls and logbook entries, feeling like I had failed at most of what I'd attempted. The job, the marriage, the whole arrangement I'd built my adult life in. And here was a voice on a radio in a mountain lookout at midnight telling me, from some time in the future, that I did good work. I am aware this is not rational. The voice, whatever it was, however it worked, was not a supervisor evaluating me. It was not someone who knew me. It was an operational note in an end-of-season report. But the words were there and I heard them, and they mattered to me in the moment, in a way that I haven't entirely made sense of since. I sat in the dark for maybe 2 hours, then I lay back down and eventually slept. In the morning I did my OBS, called Patty, did my scan. I said nothing about the previous night's transmission. I ate breakfast, and then I went through my journal, from the beginning of the season, counting confirmed incidents, with corresponding transmissions I'd recorded. I had 5 with confirmed correlating events, as I'd thought, plus 2 partial transmissions that I'd recorded but not yet matched to events Euro, one from August 1st and one from August 30th. Those 2 might become confirmed if I looked at the daily incident log more carefully, but still not 11, so there were more coming. Or there had been transmissions I'd slept through, or the count was wrong somehow, my count or the transmission's count. I wrote this out in the journal and felt very strange doing it Euro, writing an analysis of a claim made by the voice about events in my own recent past. I thought about the 4 days. September 19th, the transmission had said, departure scheduled for September 19th, 4 days early, requested by occupant. I had not decided to leave 4 days early. My contract was September 22nd. I had every financial and practical reason to work out the full contract. But the notebook. I looked at the gear bag under the cot and thought about the 4th Write in the Rain notebook, unused in the bottom of the bag, left under the cot in the storage space on the right side, against the back wall. The storage space under the cot ran the full length of the cot, divided into 2 sections by a central partition, left side and right side. I'd been using the left side for most of the season food overflow from the main shelf, extra batteries, my spare fleece. The right side had my gear bag in it, and behind the gear bag, against the back wall, would be roughly the right space for a pocket notebook. If I left a notebook there before I left deliberately, as a marker, and if I'd left on September 19th deliberately, 4 days early, and if I'd counted 11 confirmed transmission event pairings by the time I left, which implied 6 more in the next 5 days, then the transmission's description would be accurate. I was aware that by contemplating whether to leave on September 19th, I was considering allowing the transmission's prediction to come true. The transmission described me leaving on September 19th, 4 days early, at the occupant's request. If I left on September 22nd instead, the transmission would be wrong. I could test it that way. But the 6 additional incidents, if there were transmissions coming that I hadn't yet received, there would be 6 more fire events or emergency calls in the next 8 days. Staying through September 22nd meant being present for all 6. Leaving September 19th meant being present for however many occurred in the next 5 days, plus whatever happened in the 3 days after I was gone. The incidents from September 17th confirmed this. Between the morning of the 15th and the morning of the 17th, 2 days, there were 3 additional fires called in from my position. 2 were small starts in the lower Ponderosa that I spotted, reported, and watched get handled by engine crews in the same shift. One was the Black Pine Creek fire I've already described, the one that matched the August 30th transmission I'd categorized as unconfirmed, the northeast azimuth, 43 versus 44 degrees. After Black Pine, I was at 8 confirmed, plus 3 more from the September window, 11 total. The transmission's count was right. I want to be very clear that I considered leaving, not because I was afraid. I want to say this plainly. I was not afraid in any way that felt primary. What I felt was something closer to fatigue, not physical fatigue, but the fatigue of holding a question in your mind for months with no pathway toward an answer, the specific exhaustion of sustained uncertainty. and underneath that, something else I'm less comfortable naming. What I'll say is this: there was a quality to the phrase, "he did good work," that I keep returning to, and it's not the comfort I felt at 2 in the morning when I first heard it. Looking at it in the daylight of September 15th, I noticed what it didn't say. It didn't say I was fine, or that everything was okay, or that I should stay. It described something finished. Past tense. He did good work, not he is doing good work. The season, as far as whoever or whatever had filed that end-of-season summary was concerned, was already over. I was already gone. The work was already done. That's a different feeling than being told you're doing well. That's a feeling of having already served the function you were there to serve. The transmission had said, "I left at the occupant's request." That meant I chose to leave. It didn't say why. I thought about Eddie Watts's logbook. September 3rd, voice is mine. September 7th, I've decided to leave early. He had held out 2 more weeks and then left. I thought about whether those 2 weeks had produced anything, any new information, any resolution, any peace with what he'd experienced. His entries in those final weeks were competent and ordinary. There was no sign of peace and no sign of breakdown. He'd just finished out the time he'd decided to finish and then left. I thought about Krebs. I've written to Glenn about it, and I'm leaving before the end of the month. He hadn't waited either. Both of them heard their own voice or name on the radio at night, and then chose to leave. And I was now in that sequence, which meant the leaving was not a failure of nerve, but a natural end to a specific kind of stay. The tower had been transmitting end-of-season reports before the end of season for at least 36 years. The occupants left early. The paperwork said equipment anomaly, unresolved. The next season, someone new arrived, and the process started again. I was the process. I'd been the process since June. That's not a comforting thought, and I want to be honest that it wasn't comforting at the time. But it had the quality of a true thing, and I'd been looking for true things all summer. September 15th was a clear, cold morning. I did my obs. Wind northwest at 14, temp 54, RH at 42%. Good fire weather, and not nothing of 42% RH. At this time of year was still in the range where new ignitions were possible, though the fire season was clearly winding down. I called in the 0800 check. Patty acknowledged. Then, because it was the clearest morning in weeks, and I'd been thinking about this conversation since 4 a.m., I asked her if she had a moment for a longer conversation. "Go ahead," she said. I told her. All of it, organized, starting from the July 7th transmission and going through the previous night. I didn't rush it. I included the azimuth correlations, the dates, the fire behavior details, the maintenance crew information from the August 22nd transmission, the specific mention of my own phrasing in the August 26th call. I told her about the logbooks Watts, Krebs, Paulton. I told her what the previous night's transmission had said, including the personal item detail and the departure date and the phrase about confirming incidents throughout the season. I told her about the recording with the gap. I was aware, as I talked, that the radio between us was a strange medium for this conversation. There's a specific quality to radio communication that professional users learn over time. You don't interrupt, you wait for the acknowledgement, you speak in complete thoughts, you pause at the end of a section to give the other person a chance to respond. The protocol enforces a certain formality, even in conversations you didn't intend to be formal. What I was describing was extraordinary, and it was coming through in the same voice and the same cadence I used to describe weather readings and fire behavior assessments. Patty was quiet through most of it, not the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. She'd had 9 years on this radio, and I don't think she was often at a loss. It felt more like the silence of someone who was paying close attention and not going to interrupt. When I finished, there was a pause of maybe 3 seconds. Then she said, "Tom, thank you for telling me. I'm going to note this and pass it along to Glenn." I waited. She didn't add anything else. I said, "Patty, the previous people who were here both reported this to you and to Glenn, and the official record says, equipment anomaly, unresolved. I'd like to understand what that process looks like from your end." A pause. briefer than I expected. What were you hoping I could tell you? Whether anyone has investigated, whether there's a pattern in the records at the district level, whether the tower has ever been evaluated for this specific thing, not just the radio equipment, but the pattern of what's been heard and what's subsequently happened. I can tell you that the radio equipment was inspected in 2019 and found to be functioning within normal parameters, she said, and that the tower has been subject to frequency surveys from the regional office twice in the last decade. Both times, the surveys found no unusual emissions or unusual reception patterns. And the content of what people heard? Another pause. Longer this time. Tom, I want to ask you something. Are you sleeping well up there? It was a fair question, professionally speaking. Sleep disruption was on the list of things a lookout supervisor was supposed to monitor. But I was 43 years old and had been documenting azimuth readings to within 1 degree for 3 months, and I was not going to be handled that way. I said evenly, I'm sleeping fine. My obs are on time and on format. My scans are documented. I haven't had a performance issue all season. I'm asking about the operational record of this specific tower. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was the same as it always was, professional, even, kind in the specific brisk way she'd always been kind, but something in it had shifted slightly, the way a road shifts when you get to the section where the surface has been repaired too many times. I know that, she said. I'm going to have Glenn call you today, okay? He'll have more access to the historical record than I do. I noted, and still note, that she had just confirmed the historical record existed. Not that it would be helpful, not that it would answer my questions. Just that Glenn would have more access to it than she did, which meant she had some access to it, which meant the district had a historical record of something. I said okay, and she signed off. I made another cup of coffee and stood at the Osborne firefinder looking at the map for a while. The country outside the south windows was clear and bright in the September morning, the ridges going blue-violet in the distance, the timber dark, the granite outcrops catching the early light. It was one of the better views I'd had all season, which the mountains sometimes do at the endard. They give you something beautiful right before you go, as though demonstrating what you're leaving. Glenn did not call me that day. He called the following morning, September 16th, on my personal cell phone, not the radio. I was on the catwalk when it rang, and I answered it there with the wind coming off the north ridge and making my voice slightly unsteady. Glenn was careful and kind and talked to me for 20 minutes. He asked first how I was doing physically. He clarified, how was the body holding up after the season? And when I said fine, he moved through it in a way that was clearly a practice transition from welfare check to the subject at hand. He said he'd reviewed what Patty had passed along and that he wanted to be helpful. He confirmed that previous occupants had reported similar experiences. He confirmed the equipment inspections. He said, with what sounded like genuine regret, that the district had not found a technical explanation. I asked him if he thought there was a non-technical explanation. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that happens when a person is deciding something rather than thinking. Then he said, I've been a district ranger for a long time. I've worked in this forest for 22 years. I think there are things in remote high country that don't have a clean answer, and I've learned to be honest about that rather than pretend otherwise. He paused. But I'm not sure what to do with that, professionally. I said, what would doing something with it look like? He said, honestly, I don't know. We've had engineers up there, we've had radio technicians, we've had consultants. Though, that's probably more than I should tell you, because it wasn't announced. Nobody found anything. Whatever produces the transmissions, if it's a thing that can be found with the equipment people bring up there, someone would have found it by now. I said, the 1987 logbook mentions a previous occupant who wanted to ask about old logs when he got back to TWISP. Does the district have archived records from before 1987? Older logbooks? Glenn was quiet again. Then, I've tried to locate records from before 1987, and I haven't been able to. There should be seasonal documentation going back to the 1930s. The Forest Service kept good records in those years. But what we have on file for Kettle Peak before 1987 is mostly administrative facility records, equipment logs, supply records. The operational logbooks don't appear to be in our archive. And before the 1987 season, I said, was there anything in the preseason notes about the previous occupant? The one Paulton wrote about asking? I looked, Glenn said. There's a note from spring 1987 about the tower being prepared for the season. No mention of anomalous experiences from the previous year. There's a standard checkout form from 1986 that says the facility was left in good condition. He paused. If the occupant in 1986 tried to have a conversation about what they'd experienced, the record of that conversation doesn't appear to have survived. There was a quality to this that I'd been encountering since I first started asking questions about the tower. Not evasion, not really more like a specific kind of negative space. Information that should exist and didn't. Gaps that were a particular shape. An archive of operational logbooks back to the 30s, all of them missing. A 1986 occupant who'd apparently had experiences and whose account had not survived. A radio technician who was familiar with the reception history and then couldn't be reached. Everything was in the right place except the parts that would answer the question. I'd like to submit my experiences as a formal incident report, I said. Not a radio anomaly report, an actual incident report, documenting the transmission dates, the correlating events, the logbook evidence. Silence. Then, I can receive that. I'll receive it in writing if you want to send it by email when you're back in town. He said it like a door that he was willing to hold open, but not to push me through. I noticed he hadn't said he'd forward it, or that it would be reviewed, or that anyone else would see it, just that he could receive it. I said I'd send it. We hung up. I stood on the catwalk and thought about the conversation. Glenn had been honest, more honest than I'd expected. He hadn't said the transmissions weren't real. He'd said they'd tried to find the source and couldn't. He'd confirmed a pattern of missing records that predated my season. He'd said consultants had been up there, which was more than he'd apparently meant to say, and which told me that at some point, someone in the regional office had been concerned enough about this to spend money on outside expertise. And still nothing. Whatever this was, it had survived every attempt to explain it, and had outlasted several attempts to close the tower where it happened. He had also not seemed surprised. He'd seemed like a man revisiting a familiar problem, handling it with the care you use on something fragile that doesn't get better from rough handling. I went back inside and looked at the Osborne Firefinder map. I put my finger on the point marked Kettle Peak Lookout in the center of the map, and I looked at all the country around it in every direction, 50 miles of timber and ridge and drainage that I'd spent 3 months learning to read. I thought about R. Paulton in 1987, looking at the same map from the same position, hearing the same thing at night, writing, "The tower talks to itself," in the corner of a form that nobody had looked at for 36 years. I thought about what it means to be in a place where something happens that has no explanation available to you. There's a version of this that breaks people, and I'd seen some evidence of that in the logbooks. There's another version that just becomes part of what you know about the world, an unexplained fact, a data point without a theory, sitting in your memory. I wasn't ready to commit to either version yet. The following 4 days were busy. The transmission had said 11 confirmed incidents. By my careful recount, after going back through my notes and matching them to the incident log more precisely, I came to 8, 3 I'd previously identified, and 5 additional partial ones. 11 would require 3 more in the time I had remaining. Whether because of the elevated fire activity that comes with September's dry spells, or because I was paying more careful attention, the next 4 days brought 6 separate smokes and 1 SAR call. 2 of the smokes were too small for me to have received a prior transmission, .0-something acre starts in open rocky terrain, that were called in, controlled quickly, and recorded. 2 matched transmissions I'd received earlier in the season that I'd categorized as unconfirmed Euro, dates aligned, azimuths close. 1 was a new start that I spotted first and had not received a transmission about, a lightning-caused fire in the lower Ponderosa zone to the east, and 1 was the one that gave me my 11th confirmed incident. On September 17th, at 10:22, I picked up a smoke to the northeast, in the Black Pine Creek drainage, where the trail access was long and the terrain was steep enough that aerial resources would be primary. I took the azimuth of 43 degrees from Kettle Peak and called it in. Patty coordinated a helicopter scout and a tanker. The fire grew to about 4 acres before it was knocked down. In my personal journal, in the entry for the night of August 30th, when I'd taken notes on a transmission I hadn't yet confirmed, azimuth 44 degrees, northeast. Black Pine Creek area, approximately 8 to 12 miles. 2 to 5 acres, air resources primary, steep terrain, limited ground access. 43 versus 44 degrees. I wrote 11 next to that entry and looked at it for a while. Then I sat down and made a list of things to do before September 19th. Pack my personal gear, clean the cab to end of season standard, complete the facility checkout form, write the formal incident report I'd promised Glenn, leave the notebook. I want to be careful about that last one. I was not leaving the notebook because the transmission told me to. I was leaving it as a marker, a document that the pattern was still ongoing as of this season, that the next occupant would find it and know that someone had been here in 2023 who had noted everything, who had documented what was happening with care. I wrote in the 4th Write in the Rain notebook, the unused one, a summary of the season's transmissions with dates, azimuths, and corresponding incidents. I wrote Eddie Watts's name and said to look at his entries in the 2021 logbook. I wrote R. Paulton's name and said to look at the 1987 logbook. I wrote my name and said that I was willing to be contacted and that my contact information was on file with the district. I put the notebook under the cot, in the storage space, right side, against the back wall. On September 18th, the night before I planned to leave, I stayed awake until 2 in the morning. I didn't plan to. I just couldn't sleep, and I wasn't going to force it on the last night. And I sat in the wooden chair with the lantern on low and looked at the Osborne firefinder and drank the last of the good coffee I'd been rationing since early September. At 01:34 the radio opened. I had my notepad, but I didn't reach for it. I listened with my hands in my lap. The voice said, "End of season summary, Kettle Peak Lookout, 2023 season. Lookout occupied June 15th through September 19th. Total season, 96 days. Total smoke reports filed, 14. Total confirmed fires, 11. Largest fire, Timber Creek, 340 acres. Personnel accountability events, 2. Equipment status, all systems functional at close of season. No injuries, no lost time." Brief pause. Special notation, the 2023 season at Kettle Peak Lookout produced the most thoroughly documented record of the anomalous transmission phenomenon in the station's history. Full documentation is retained by the occupant and has been reported to the district ranger. This documentation includes dates, times, verbatim transcript notes, and confirmed correlating incident records for 11 verified events. The occupant Euro, a very slight pause, the same one that had come before my name the first time, has been informed that his incident report will be received by the district office. Another pause. The phenomenon continues. Channel close. Silence. I sat for a long time. The propane heater ticked. Outside, a wind was picking up off the northwest ridge, the same direction it came from most often, and the tower made its structural sounds, the deep flex of the steel legs, and the rattle of a loose bolt on the catwalk railing I'd been meaning to tighten all season and had kept forgetting. The phenomenon continues, present tense. I turned off the lantern, I lay down on the cot in my jacket and sleeping bag, and I looked at where the ceiling was in the dark. In the morning, I would call Patty and tell her I wanted to arrange an early departure for the following day. Frank would be notified and would meet me at the trailhead. I would pack my gear and do the checkout procedures. I would carry the pack down the trail one more time, climb into Frank's truck, and drive back down to the valley and back to whatever came next. The phenomenon continues, not past tense, not the phenomenon has occurred. Present tense, active, ongoing. I fell asleep at some point before 5. When I woke up, the sky outside the east window was gray-pink, and there was frost on the catwalk railing. The raven was somewhere below on the ridge, making its normal morning sounds. I made coffee, I called Patty at 0800, gave her the weather obs, and then said I'd like to discuss departing a day early if that was possible to arrange. She said she'd check with Frank about the trailhead meeting. She called back on my cell at 0830 and said Frank could be at the trailhead at 1300 the following day, September 19th. I said that worked. I spent September 18th packing, cleaning, completing the checkout form. The cleanup was methodical and took most of the day. I wiped down the Osborne firefinder. I cleaned the windows. I checked all the equipment one more time and documented it on the checkout form. Battery bank at 85%. I'd charged it fully the day before. Propane supply, I estimated 3 weeks at my average usage. Cistern, at about 40%, confirmed by the level gauge. The checkout form had a section for observations and recommendations. I wrote, recommend review of archival radio transmission records for anomalous reception incidents. Previous documentation available from occupants E. Watts, 2021, and D. Krebs, 2019. See 1987 logbook for additional historical record. Full incident report has been submitted to District Ranger G. Yarber. I left the form in the inbox binder. I looked around the cab once more, checking that I hadn't left anything I was supposed to take. The green Write in the Rain notebook was under the cot. The other notebooks, the ones that were mine, with my journal, were in my pack. I had everything. I walked the outside of the cab one last time and stood on the catwalk, each side in turn. The country from this height was as big as it had been the first day, and I knew it now, in a way I hadn't known anything in a long time. I could name what I was seeing. I could read it. The larch on the east ridges had turned fully yellow in the last week, and the color against the dark fir and the pale granite was striking in a way that the country in September always is. I went inside. I ate dinner. I lay down. I slept well, for the first time in several nights. No transmissions. The night was quiet and cold, and the tower held the heat from the heater, and I slept until 5:30 without waking. In the morning, I shouldered my pack and went down the stairs. I counted 73 steps from the top to the catwalk, same as the first time, same number every time. The number had always been the same. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't have felt significant but did, in the way that small consistencies become significant when everything else around them has been uncertain. I walked across the summit one more time before I headed into the tree line. I stood at the southeast corner of the summit and looked out over the Timber Creek drainage and thought about the fire that had burned there in late July, the smoke column going up against the afternoon sky, the timber sale administrator who'd gotten out, the crews who'd worked it for 4 days. I thought about the transmission that had told me about it 2 days in advance. I thought about the fact that I'd been looking in that direction, at that drainage, with slightly more attention than usual in the days before it started, because the transmission had put it in my mind. Whether that had made any difference was a question I'd been turning over since August. If I'd been slightly more attentive to the right quadrant on the afternoon of July 29th, I might have called it in 10 or 15 minutes earlier. Whether that had changed anything in the outcome, the fire was contained. The administrator was safe. I couldn't say. Maybe it would have been fine regardless. Maybe not. I didn't know, and I wasn't going to know. I went into the tree line and down the trail. The trail had a particular quality on the way down that it never had on the way up. You could see further ahead of you, and the destination, the trailhead, the road, the truck, the valley had a reality that the summit never quite had on the way in, when it was still abstract. I walked steadily, not hurrying. The aspens in the switchback section had gone fully yellow in the last week, and the color, against the dark Douglas fir below them and the pale rock above, was the specific kind of beautiful that the mountains produce in September that you can't really describe to someone who hasn't seen it, because it depends on the cold and the quality of the light and something about the knowledge that it won't last. A Clark's nutcracker worked through the whitebark pines near the ridgeline, making its harsh call. The picas in the talus below the ridge were vocal. The country was fully alive in the way it is at the end of the season, finishing what the summer started. I came down to the trailhead at 12:40, and Frank was already there. The gray F-350 idling, his window down, a coffee thermos on the dash. I put my pack in the truck bed and got in the passenger side. Frank handed me the thermos without being asked, which I thought was a generous thing, and I took it, and didn't say anything for a minute, just held the warm metal and watched the dust settle in the pullout. He pulled out of the trailhead onto the forest road, and we started down. The road was in reasonable shape for September, some washboarding from the summer traffic, a couple of spots where erosion had narrowed it to one lane, but nothing Frank's truck couldn't handle at reduced speed. He drove the way he walked, efficient, unhurried, thoroughly practiced. We'd been driving for maybe 5 minutes, maybe a little more, when I saw the other truck. It came around a left-hand curve about 300 feet ahead of us, raising a plume of dust in the dry September afternoon, moving at the same pace Frank moved Euro, not fast, the pace of someone who knew the road. It was a gray F-350, with a bed rack and equipment strapped under a tarp and a Forest Service shield on the door. I watched it approach. The light was good, and the distance closed quickly. Frank eased to the right of the road to prepare for the pass in the narrow section ahead. I looked at the truck's bed, same rack, same tarp, same arrangement. I looked at the door, same shield, same agency lettering. I looked at the driver, same ball cap, same mustache, same build, same straight-ahead focus on the road. The trucks passed each other with maybe 6 inches to spare in the narrow section, the way you have to on a one-lane mountain road, and I turned to watch through the rear window as the other truck continued up toward the trailhead. I sat with my hands in my lap. My coffee was in my right hand, and I was aware of not spilling it. I was also aware that I was performing normalcy for approximately no reason, since I was the only observer of myself, and I put the thermos in the cup holder and looked at Frank. Frank was looking at the road. His expression was the expression of a man concentrating on driving, which the road genuinely required, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that was slightly different from the rest of the drive. I said, "Was that you?" He drove for another 20 feet or so. Then, "That's my regular Thursday run. I come up on Thursdays. Today's Wednesday." "Yep." I sat with that. The truck continued down the hill. The Ponderosa Zone came up around us, and the forest closed in on both sides, and the light changed from the open sky light of the high country to the filtered, wood-smelling light of the timber. Frank drove. The radio wasn't on. Finally I said, "Does that happen often?" He thought about it, which was its own kind of answer. "Twice before," he said. "Both times a person was leaving early. Both times I drove down on a day other than Thursday." He paused. "I don't know what it is. I don't think about it. Is it relevant to what I've been experiencing up there?" He thought about this too. "I don't know what's relevant," he said. "I don't understand what you've been experiencing up there. I just know it's something that happens in that place, and that the only honest thing I can say about it is that it happens." We didn't talk much after that. When he dropped me at the ranger station in Twisp, I shook his hand. He held it a moment longer than usual, not meaningfully, just the way you shake someone's hand when you're thinking about something else. He said, "Take care of yourself, Tom." I said I would. He drove away. I stood in the ranger station parking lot in the September afternoon and watched his truck go north on the highway until it turned out of sight, and then I stood there a little longer because I wasn't sure where I was going next or quite how to begin going there. I found a motel in Twisp for one night, took the first hot shower I'd had in weeks, ate a real meal at a restaurant on the main street. I called Danny and told him I was coming back, and he said that was good news and asked how the job had been. I said it had been interesting. He said he'd found a posting for a county engineer position in Chelan County that I might look at. I said I'd look at it. The drive back to Yakima the next morning took me west on Highway 20 over the Cascades Pass, which was still open in September, and I stopped at the summit pullout and got out of the truck and looked east for a while. The Methau Valley was visible in the distance, a green cut through the drylands, and beyond it the ridges that led up to Kettle Peak country, too far away to see individually. I stood there longer than I planned to. It was cold at the pass, mid-September cold, and there was frost on the guardrail, and the light was the clear, hard light that comes with the first cool air mass of autumn. I thought about the cab and the Osborne firefinder and the green Write in the Rain notebook against the back wall of the storage space. I thought about the voice saying, in its even professional register, he did good work. Then I got back in the truck and drove down the west side. The next 2 weeks were re-entry, which is harder than it sounds after 96 days of genuine solitude. Danny and Rachel were generous about letting me stay at the house again while the Chelan job was sorted out, and I was grateful, but the adjustment was real. The noise of normal life was astonishing at first. Not loud noise, just the constant ambient of other people's lives, television through a wall, a neighbor's car starting, a phone ringing, the particular social pressure of a shared household where there are small negotiations happening all the time that you have to be present for. I'd thought the isolation would be what I struggled with. Coming back to noise was harder. I couldn't sleep well for the first 2 weeks, not because of nightmares or anxiety, at least not in any obvious form, more because the cot at Kettle Peak had trained me to a specific kind of sleep, deep and early and uninterrupted, and the motel bed and then Danny's guest bed were neither of those things. I'd lie awake and listen to the house sounds, and my brain would keep mapping them onto the tower sounds, looking for the click of the radio channel opening. Nothing opened. The nights were just nights. I did submit the incident report to Glenn Yarber. I sent it as a 12-page document with attachments, photos of the relevant logbook pages, photos of my notepad transcriptions, a table of confirmed transmission incident pairs with dates, times, azimuths, and source notes. I sent it by email in October and got a reply that said he'd received it and would be in touch. I've not heard from him since. I've sent 2 follow-up emails that received no reply. In November, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest for the complete incident log from Kettle Peak Lookout for the 2023 fire season. The request went through the regional office. I received a response in late January that included a PDF of the incident log. I went through the log carefully. My smoke reports were all there, correctly filed under my call sign. The resource requests, the fire sizes, the dates, all matching my own records. 11 confirmed incidents. There was 1 additional entry. It was filed at the bottom of the log after my last official entry of September 18th. The date on it was September 21st. 3 days after I left, 2 days after my contract ended. The call sign was Kettle Peak Lookout, my call sign. The entry read, Hazmat Advisory, FS Road 9140 closure, overturned vehicle with fuel spill, mile marker 7, estimate road closure 48 hours, no fire risk at this time, no injuries, lookout coordination not required. September 21st, 3 days after I left. 2 days after the tower was unmanned. There would have been no lookout on September 21st to file an entry. The tower would have been empty. My contract had ended. No new occupant was scheduled, as far as I knew, until next season. But a road closure incident at mile marker 7 on FS Road 9140 was filed under my call sign on September 21st from a station that should have been empty. I spent 2 weeks looking at that entry from various angles. The obvious explanations were administrative, a filing error, a clerical mistake that put the event under the wrong call sign or wrong date, an event from my season that was entered retroactively, a misuse of the call sign by someone at the district office who needed to file something and used the first lookout call sign on the list. These are plausible. I can't rule them out, but the entry followed the format perfectly arome, including the lookout coordination not required phrase, which is specific language used when a lookout unit has been contacted and cleared of responsibility. Someone had written an entry that implied the lookout at Kettle Peak had been involved in this event. The format was correct in all its particulars, including the notation structure that I'd used throughout my season. If it was a filing error, it was a very careful one. I filed a follow-up FOIA for the radio transmission log from September 19th through 22nd, asking specifically for any communications on the main district frequency involving the Kettle Peak Lookout call sign. That request was denied. The denial cited the Forest Service's standard exemption for internal administrative communications under FOIA exemption, B5, which is the exemption for deliberative process materials documents that contain internal government discussions about policy or decisions that haven't been finalized. An internal administrative communication about a road closure at mile marker 7. I hired a lawyer to challenge the exemption. She sent a formal letter. The response, which took 3 months, said the exemption had been correctly applied and that no further disclosure was anticipated. I want to be very clear that I don't know what any of this means. I've laid out exactly what I experienced and exactly what I found afterward, in the order that I found it. I've tried not to connect dots that shouldn't be connected, and not to present speculation as fact. What I've described is what I know. I've tried to find Eddie Watts. His name isn't on any of the professional directories I have access to, not in forestry, not in fire management, where I looked because he seemed experienced. I found one reference to an Edward Watts who had worked as a fire lookout in Washington State, in a brief mention in a district newsletter from 2020 that described staffing at several lookout stations. The contact information for him that the district would have was not available to me through FOIA. I did find, through a general web search, a social services directory listing in Spokane County that included an Edward Watts at an address in the eastern Spokane suburbs, listed as receiving services from an organization that appeared to provide mental health and transitional housing support. I don't know if it's the same person. I didn't contact them because I didn't know what I'd say, and because whatever Eddie Watts's situation is, arriving as a stranger with questions about what he heard on a radio in a mountain lookout seemed more likely to cause harm than help. Krebs I couldn't find at all. David Krebs is a common enough name that the search results were useless, and I didn't have enough additional information to narrow it down. He'd been at the tower in 2019 and left in early September, and filed a report with Glenn, and after that there was nothing I could trace. In January, I also filed a separate records request for the employment and personnel records related to Kettle Peak Lookout for the years 1985 through 2023, asking specifically for documentation of any incidents involving the lookout occupant leaving before the end of the contract period and the stated reason for early departure. This request was partially fulfilled. I received a table showing 6 instances of early departure between 1985 and my season, which was more than I'd identified from the logbooks. The stated reasons were family emergency, twice, voluntary resignation, twice, medical, once, and for the remaining instance, the reason field was blank. The blank was for a departure in 1994, a year for which there was no logbook on the shelf in the cab. I requested more detail about the 1994 departure and was told there was no additional documentation available. 6 early departures in 38 years. The tower wasn't open every year there had been the 2 closures Frank mentioned, and other gaps in the record, so 6 out of however many occupants the tower had housed in that span was a proportion I couldn't calculate precisely, but suspected was significant. I made a list of what I knew and what remained unknown, which is an engineering habit I've always found clarifying, even when the unknowns outnumber the knowns. What I knew: the phenomenon had occurred at Kettle Peak in at least 1987, 2019, 2021, and 2023. It involved reception of radio transmissions in Forest Service spot report format, describing incidents that subsequently occurred, with dates matching 1 to 5 days in advance of the actual events, and azimuth readings consistently off by 1 degree. The transmissions used the Kettle Peak Lookout call sign. Previous occupants who reported the phenomenon had not been publicly believed or had their reports formally investigated. The Forest Service radio technician was familiar with the station's reception history. The tower had been closed twice without official explanation. A post-departure incident report had been filed under my call sign from an unmanned station. What I didn't know: the source of the transmissions, the mechanism by which fire incidents could be described in advance, why the azimuth offset was consistent, whether the phenomenon had a beginning, a date, before which it hadn't been happening, or whether it had been there since construction, whether anyone in the Forest Service hierarchy knew what it actually was, as opposed to knowing that it happened and choosing not to explain it, whether the camera system that was replacing seasonal lookouts would affect it or be unaffected by it, whether the notebook I'd left would be found by the next occupant, or removed before the season started. I don't know how to weigh these two lists against each other. The known list is substantial enough that I feel I have something real. The unknown list is substantial enough that I'm not sure what to do with what I have. The Chelan County job has been good. I'm working on a bridge inspection program and some drainage design for rural roads, which is exactly the kind of work I know how to do. The office is small, 6 people, and my supervisor is a man named Walt Brennan, who has been doing county engineering since before I got my degree, and who has a particular patience for bridge load calculations that I find genuinely admirable. The county is the kind of place where the work matters in a direct way. You design a drainage culvert, and you drive past it 6 months later, and it's doing what you designed it to do. It was there before you, and it'll be there after. This is satisfying in a way I'd undervalued when I had it before. I have an apartment in Chelan, 2 rooms on the 2nd floor of a building a few blocks from the lake, which I moved into in November. It's nothing special, but it's mine, in a way that Danny's spare room never was. And there's something about having your own space again after not having it that reminds you of things you'd stopped noticing. I bought a bed, a desk, a secondhand chair. I hung a topo map of the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest on the wall of the 2nd room, which I use as an office. The Kettle Peak summit is on the left edge of the map, in the upper corner, just within the boundaries of the coverage area. I look at it sometimes, not deliberately, though. It's just on the wall and I sit at the desk and it's there. But I'm aware that I chose that map, out of the several that cover roughly the same region, for that specific reason. I still have the journals from the tower. All 3 of the used Write in the Rain notebooks, full, with the dates and the transmissions and the correlating incidents documented. They're in a file box in the closet, in a manila folder marked Kettle Peak 2023. I've thought about what to do with them. I've thought about sending them to the Forest Service regional office with another formal letter and the documentation I assembled from the FOIA responses. I've thought about giving them to a journalist, though I don't know who would care or how to find someone who would, and the story requires a level of technical context that doesn't condense easily to the format that attracts attention. I've thought about just keeping them in the drawer and leaving them there. I'm writing this account because I decided, sometime in February, that the most honest thing to do with what I experienced was to put it into words as carefully as I could and make it available, and let whoever finds it decide what to do with it. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not asking anyone to investigate. I'm presenting what I observed, in sequence, with the relevant technical context, and I'm leaving the interpretation to whoever's reading. I'm aware that this account will strike some people as the document of a person who had a bad year and an unusual summer job, and who is now trying to assign meaning to experiences that might not have the meaning he's assigning to them. I've considered this possibility seriously. I've gone back through the sequence of events, looking for the places where I might have allowed the desire for something to be true to shape what I concluded about it. I've tried to be skeptical about my own memory and my own notes. What I keep coming back to is the recording. The phone recording with the gap in the ambient sound where the transmission should be. If I was confabulating the content of the transmissions, if my brain was constructing coherent professional radio language out of noise and then conveniently remembering it as matching subsequent events, the recording gap wouldn't be there. The gap is something the phone measured, not something I remembered. The gap is the one piece of evidence from this whole account that doesn't depend on my reliability as a witness. The gap is the length of the transmission I transcribed in my notes, and it is at the timestamp I wrote down, and inside it there is nothing. There's one more thing I haven't mentioned, because it took me the longest to figure out how to include it without sounding like I'm pushing toward a conclusion I haven't earned. In February, 2 months after I started the Chelan job, I was driving the county truck on a rural road southeast of town to do a site assessment on a bridge over a small creek. It was a road I'd been on twice before, both times in the context of drainage work, and I knew roughly where the bridge was and about how long the drive would take. I had the window down because February in central Washington is cold, but the sun was out and the dry air had a quality I'd liked since the tower. I came around a left-hand curve in a canyon and I saw a column of smoke. It was a small column, thin and white, coming from a gully on the right side of the road about half a mile ahead. The fuel was mixed dry grass and scrub brush, and some old fence posts along the property boundary, and the fire was maybe 1/10 of an acre or less. It was small enough that it might have been a burning barrel or a controlled burn, but the character was wrong for either of those. It wasn't concentrated enough. It was spreading too laterally, and there was no vehicle or person visible near it. I pulled over and called it in to 911, and then sat with my hands on the wheel and watched the smoke column. It was 1/10 of an acre, white-gray, slow-moving, surface fire in dry grass, low spotting potential. No structures immediately at risk. The thing I noticed was that I had already put together the spot report before I'd consciously decided to. It was just there, organized, in the professional language I'd spent 96 days making automatic. Azimuth from my position, though I didn't have the equipment to take a formal azimuth and had no use for one in this context. Location reference, fuel type, estimated size, behavior assessment, resource recommendation, the whole package, automatic, in about 3 seconds. I was good at the job. That's what I'd taken from those 96 days. The rest of it on the transmissions, the logbooks, the voice, the gap in the recording, the second Frank truck on the forest road. I carried all of that and hadn't resolved any of it, and probably wasn't going to. But I was good at the job. The country had taught me to pay attention in a specific way, and I still pay attention that way, and that felt like the most concrete thing I'd come home with. The fire department arrived 8 minutes later. The fire was contained at 0.2 acres. I wrote up the bridge assessment and drove back to the office, and didn't tell anyone about the spot report I'd compiled in my head while waiting for the fire department. It wasn't relevant to anything. It was just something I knew how to do now, in a way I hadn't before the summer. I think about Kettle Peak Lookout sometimes in the way you think about places that change something about you that you can't quite name. Not often, but with a specificity that surprises me when it comes up the exact color of the larch in September. The sound the Osborne firefinder's Aladad made when you swung it, the particular quality of the radio static between transmissions, the way the tower moved in high wind, with a flexibility that should have felt alarming and instead, after the first week, felt solid. The cab at night, with the lantern on low and the mountains dark outside every window, and the radio on its shelf with its green channel indicator light, and the notepad with the pencil on a string, waiting. There are a few things I'd rather state directly than leave implicit. I did not imagine the transmissions. They occurred on equipment I've described accurately, in a location that exists, on dates I've documented with corroborating records. The 11 confirmed incident correlations are in my personal journals, cross-referenceable against the official district incident log I received through FOIA. The journals are in a file box in my apartment in Chelan. They don't look like anything. 3 waterproof notebooks with weather data and azimuth readings and fire behavior notes, and then in the margins, in pencil, the other thing. R. Paulton experienced it in 1987, David Krebs in 2019, Eddie Watts in 2021. Their documentation is still in the old logbooks at the tower, or should be. I don't know what condition those logbooks are in now. I went to a doctor in December for a regular checkup and mentioned I'd had some sleep disruption during a remote work assignment. She found nothing concerning. My performance record at the district is intact. My OBs were accurate and on schedule. I did my job. What I can't answer, what I've turned over for 9 months now, on commutes and in the middle of the night, and on lunch breaks when I park the county truck by whatever bridge I'm inspecting that week, is the why of it. I don't know what the transmissions were. I don't know who was speaking, or whether who is even the right word. I don't know why the azimuth readings were always off by 1 degree. Always 1 degree. No more, no less. I don't know why this has been happening at this specific station for at least 36 years, and the official response to every person who has reported it has been inspections that found nothing wrong and silence afterward. I find the silence harder to accept than the transmissions. The transmissions were at least consistent. The silence is a choice someone keeps making. I think about the end-of-season transmission sometimes. The voice saying, "The phenomenon continues." Present tense. There's a new occupant on that tower this season. I assume, given that the tower was operational last season. They're up there now. Probably. doing their obs, learning the terrain, eating oatmeal from the shelf, and scanning through binoculars, and calling in their smoke reports to Patty at 1000 and 1600. They may already have heard the first transmission, or they may not hear it until deep into August, the way I didn't. Or they may have a quiet season and come down in September never having heard it at all. I don't know how to tell them. I left the notebook. That's all I could do. The green Write in the Rain notebook with the summary of what I found is under the cot, right side, against the back wall.